I've tried to rewrite my about section for 4 years, and I started again. Every year I get this desire to do it. I'm like, I gotta reframe my experience so it can be relatable. And then so yesterday I started at 10 p.m. and I finished at 1:30 a.m. and I'm still dissatisfied with it. So it just goes back into the notes. And so we'll try again next year.
Wait, how many hours did you spend on it?
Whatever the time. So 10:30 to 1:30. So 10:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. I even got ChatGPT to help me out, and I wasn't very satisfied, and so I started editing it, and then I started suggesting edits to it, and then even it gave up on me. It started just repeating itself at that point. So I just went to bed.
The dilemma of writing and updating your LinkedIn bio, the about section, and the titles.
Absolutely.
Well, speaking of which, can you openly talk about that? Obviously, I mean, of course, your current LinkedIn profile says Director, Strategic Design and Products, but I know that it's going to change, right?
So as of recently, I'm now the head of product management and strategic design at PwC in Canada. So that's, that's obviously both a privilege, but also a lot of fun because I get to help shape what product management means in an organization like PwC that's been around for over 100 years, and try to help it, survive and thrive for another 100 years. And so how does software play a role in all of that? And how does, design play a role in business on a go-forward basis as well? So it's a very interesting time to be there, and it's a real privilege to have the mandate. So yeah, that's the update I'm trying to portray, but I haven't got around to it because I'm not satisfied with the words and the positioning of it just yet.
Dude, you're a person of many, 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 many talents. And firstly, thank you for making that introduction that now you're like the head at a PwC. Holy smokes. And I remember, I think for the audience listening, it'll be good to first dive into how do we know each other, how we met, and then we should actually go a little bit into your background, into some of your education and some of the different things that you've learned. Like, for example, you were learning filmmaking. So let's start with first, how do we know each other?
Where did we meet? We met at Format. Why don't you talk a bit about how you even landed at Format that day, and then we can talk about how we stay connected.
I have a friend, Preet, and I probably name drop him in almost every episode. But when I just immigrated to Canada in 2015, he was already plugged into the design world. He was working for well.ca and he was a designer there. And so I was living in Brampton. He was living in downtown. He was living in a basement, typical immigrant story.
Yep.
And so, because I had nothing to do, I had no job and nothing on my plate or on my calendar, I would just show up to his house or wherever he was, typically in a Starbucks cafe. And he'd be like, okay, let's go to this event. And he would just take me to all these different places and introduce me to people. And this is on this one occasion, he actually took me to this Format company. And he's like, oh, they're having a social. We'll get drinks. We'll talk to people. And there we are. It's a very beautiful looking startup company. And I'm like, wow, I've come from India. And I'm like, this is really cool. The scene here. Pretty excited. And that's where I come face to face with Yousuf.
Yeah, you and I got to meet at that event. I had just started working at Format maybe a few months before that. Or maybe it was at the tail end. I can't exactly remember where in my time over there. But I think that was... your impression of the space was actually similar to my impression. I mean, I immigrated here as well. I came here in 2000. I came with my parents. I went to high school here, and had to figure out my teenage years and my identity. And I think that's like an ongoing thing. I'm sure we'll touch on that as well because it bleeds well into career identity as well. But that's where you and I met. And I have to say, being at Format and in that moment in time, was a kind of career therapy that I needed because I had just exited the advertising world and I had done some really amazing things that I'm still proud of. but I think I was, without realizing it, um, running out of steam. And I have a different vocabulary and definition of that we can talk about later. But when I walked into Format, when Lucas hired me, I felt the frenetic energy just drop. The room was quiet. I felt like the place could have been a yoga studio. There's such talented people doing such great work, and in a very humble way, was such a different environment. But I also didn't feel like I fit in. But I think I was also brought there to do some things that were different to how people were doing them already. But I got to meet you there, Paul, and I was also amazed at your talents because of all that you had accomplished and how you were positioning yourself and re-entering, the creative space. Yeah, I was just so impressed by all that you've done, and I'm so grateful that you've invited me here today to chat. And equally, I hope that you get to tell me a bit about your story so everyone listening gets to see and hear more about the person behind the camera who's always producing such great work and bringing interesting people to the table.
Right. Super funny how you mentioned that. Yeah, I it was really cool to meet you, and you were like, I'm doing brand strategy, and we talked, and in fact, I remember we met after that at a bar in like Liberty Village.
Yes.
And we had a conversation and I was like, I have some ideas, and you're like, yeah, you know what, actually. You weren't like dismissive, which most people are, especially when I just moved here. Most people were like, no. I heard probably like no 2,000 times. But you were like very encouraging. You're like, oh, those are really cool ideas, even if they probably sucked.
I doubt they did.
And anyway, so, I was like, this is a cool guy. Even, if the idea sucked, he still heard me out, had a great time. And I kept following your journey. I kept seeing you from the sidelines. Like, okay, I remember this guy I met. So I kept seeing, oh, okay, he's moved here now. Oh, he left, and now he's joined this place. So just from the sidelines. And then recently, when I was just looking at some content on LinkedIn, I was like, I saw something that you had written, and I was like, wait a second, this is a perfect person to have on the pod to talk about some of these different varied experiences. So one of the things that really speaks to, and one of the reasons why I have you here is, of course, we'll talk about, similar situation in terms of immigrating from a different country, different context to North America. That's definitely one thing. But this ability that you have is that you're not like niche down. You have like a whole bunch of different skills, and you apply them in different contexts. So, but before we dive into the immigrant story, or maybe that's, I think, a much better place to start is, so where did you grow up? What was your experience of the world growing up? And then when you moved here, how things changed? So let's start there.
Okay. And it might actually feed into your observation about being a generalist. And I think, so my heritage is Pakistani. My dad's from the north of Pakistan. My mom's from Karachi. I was born in Abu Dhabi. I grew up in Dubai. This is far before, it was as cool and big and glamorous and large as it is today. And I never got a chance to live in Pakistan. As some people may know, living in the United Arab Emirates, you can work there, you can live there, but you are not granted any citizenship. So you don't really feel that there is a sort of home base. You're told that your home is where your father comes from, and that's kind of your identity. So Pakistan obviously was a place that I had visited because my family was there, my grandparents were there. There's a feeling when you're there, but it wasn't what I would consider home. And then Dubai wasn't home. And then we moved to Toronto. And I realized at that stage, I needed to say that this place was home. And I was only, I think, around 14 years old at that point. And going through that, there's a bit of a reinvention. I got to leave behind some of the narratives and thematics that I was exposed to in the Middle East. Being, Pakistani, going to a British school, I had a wonderful experience in terms of education, but maybe a slightly difficult social experience because there weren't a lot of, what we call now minorities like myself in that school. But I had great friends at the end of the day, but I also had a lot of, difficult interactions and things like that. So I got to shed some of that branding that people gave me because of my, ethnic identity, and come here and reinvent myself. And when I showed up here, again, I was different there and I was different here. I had an accent, according to everybody in high school here. And this time, though, the accent was regarded as something intriguing and interesting rather than foreign and frightening. And so they would say, "Oh, Yousuf, you sound like you have a British accent, or you sound South African, or something like that." And automatically that disarmed people, and I got to make friends very quickly. And so Toronto really offered me a fresh start. And then I got to not only explore different, friends groups and different cultures and different foods, things I hadn't seen, nearly as much or nearly as frequently living in Dubai and, in the 90s and in the 90s. And so with that came the desire to explore different things. So technology, like my mom and dad, we got a computer in the late 90s, the internet, we finally got that in the late 90s as well. And that interest just basically carried forward in Canada. And what began as an interest in, how do I install games on a computer, to how do websites work and how can I design my own website and get my own domain name, all the way through to when we arrived here, because I had already learned how to make websites. When my parents were looking for real estate to live in, I pitched the real estate agent who still knows me and is still connected with me on LinkedIn. His name's Nick. I pitched him and I said, "I think you need a website because the one you have doesn't look as professional as it could." And so he said, "Listen, kid, like, what are you going to make for me?" I said, no, I'll brand you and I'll do a website for you. And the guy gave me a chance. And so I actually rebranded him, gave him a website, new business cards, new everything. And that's kind of how I realized that a place like Toronto and this environment in this context, I was able to explore my interests, and those interests that were kind of not really cool and accepted maybe in Dubai and my friend circle there was certainly more valuable here. And I could just do it and people saw value in it and I got to enjoy it as well. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I kind of took you down a rabbit hole.
There's one thing that people might not be aware of is, and I had my own experience of this being in India, but as an Indian or Pakistani person living in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, what's that experience like? Because I think it'd be cool. And but even though you went to a British school and that's where you got some of that, your British lineage.
Yeah. So many jokes, I can say. Okay. So I think growing up in the 90s in Dubai, as a Pakistani, I think there's some things back then that probably don't exist or aren't as overtly evident today. First is, I think there's a very implied class system, perhaps. I'm not sure if I'm using the right terminology, but as you know, that there are very few Emiratis or locals. And they rule the land, it's their land, and they're gracious enough to invite people to help them build their economy and grow their country. But you're always a guest, whether you're Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, South African, or from the UK. You're always a guest. And it's easy to forget that when you grow up there and you believe that's home and you have a routine and you have your friends. But there are always small reminders that you're still a guest. There are certain rules that you don't break because, it's in or out. So if you've broken any rules or, social disruption or have strong opinions politically and such, and again, that's more applicable to adults. I was a child. So, those would not be very welcomed. And you and your family may not be a welcome guest anymore. So I think there was just always reminders that this is not a permanent place. And so overall, that would be sort of the looming cloud. But in that was great joy too, because I got to be with an international community. I loved skateboarding. I loved riding my bike. I loved being outdoors, and it afforded me all of that. You're by the ocean. It was a city. Whether it was big or not is irrelevant now. But you're in the city, but there's an ocean. You have your friends. In your early teens, you don't really need a whole lot more. And so I really have fond memories about that. And I still keep in touch with those friends, and their careers and their career trajectories have been pretty awesome as well. And I think all of them have had a similar experience of trying to reconcile. So is that home, or where my parents came from? Is that home? And what is home? Those are some things that, whether they came from Australia or not, those are things that we can all talk about.
And by the way, when you were, because you said, as you said that you were born in Abu Dhabi.
Yep.
But you basically grew up in Dubai. So did you end up visiting Pakistan and going on?
I did. Yeah, I loved it. So I used to visit Pakistan, if not 3 times a year, then definitely twice with my parents. And we'd go visit my grandparents who used to live there, both on my mom's side and my dad's side. We used to spend time in Karachi, where my cousins used to be as well. And being in, it's such a juxtaposition, even Dubai in the 90s versus Karachi in the 90s. Organized chaos is what Karachi is. It has its own charm, and it's, millions and millions of people. And, sometimes the electricity goes off, and the summers are hot, and anyway, it has its own charm. And then you go to a very orderly city with everything is new roads in Dubai, new buildings, everything appears clean. So it's such a juxtaposition. And there's also, as you could imagine, just like in India, there's immense poverty. And so it's a very humbling reality to realize the privilege you have. And it was a very good reminder for me every time I went back to be grateful for what I have. And also to kind of check my values, because every once in a while, living in a place where there's a lot of wealth around you, you can lose yourself. And back then it was, what cell phone model do you have? And, what skateboard brand are you rocking? Where are you getting your clothes from? Like that kind of stuff as a teenager. So yeah, had great memories going there. Again, I didn't quite fit in there, because when I'd show up, my cousin and my cousin's friends would always say, well, I try to speak Urdu, and I'd obviously do my best, but I had an accent there too. So it didn't quite fit in over there either. But, my cousins all made me feel welcome and warm. And in fact, I went to visit my aunt and my uncle, who now live in Vancouver, who I'd often visit in Karachi. And on my dad's side, we'd go to the mountain region north of Peshawar. And so that was a totally different environment. It's mountains and greenery and clean air, and more village-esque, and just humble, and it's just beautiful. It's kind of, it's crazy to think that my dad and his brothers and my grandparents, hail from such a small and interesting village, but did some pretty awesome things over time and in life. But you can come from anywhere and do that. That's the beautiful thing, right? And you can always return.
Seeing that part of the world, seeing how things are done, how people behave, and then when you move to a city of course, I mean, you grew up in the Middle East, let's say.
Yeah.
But, you and I share like a history from Pakistan and Punjab. I'm from Punjab, Chandigarh, which is like, they're like, imagine for the audience listening, that's like Quebec and Ontario.
Yes.
Pretty much. So they're, and at one point they were just one state.
Yeah.
Anyways. And the funny thing is that both Punjab on the side of India and Pakistan, they speak Urdu, and in Punjab they speak Punjabi, but a lot of the language is very similar, but the script is completely different.
Yeah.
And my dad has a lot of fun stories of that. As a kid, I even visited Pakistan. Because there's all these Sikh temples.
Yeah.
there. So I've been to Pakistan, and but there's a lot of rich stories, heritage, juxtaposition, dichotomy, and the way people live, and even the people who are financially not very well off, they're still happy.
That's something I noticed too. I would totally agree with you.
And there's you don't see the kind of, let's say, mental trauma as much publicly as you would, let's say, see in a Western world. It's really cool that you got a chance to, at a young age, got to see firsthand and experience those things. That really adds like a whole bunch of dimension and perspective to things that are happening, let's say today in 2023 in like the first world country like Canada and America. And you're growing up, and at some point your parents decide to move to Canada. So how does that happen? And
that's a great question. And I think that I've come to really appreciate the courage it takes for someone to make a move. Just like you made a move, that takes courage. That really does. For my parents, they're reaching retirement age in the Middle East, especially my dad. So when you're at that time, retirement age meant thank you for your 2 decades, time to leave the country now. And so my mom and my dad were like, we could go back to Pakistan, but they hadn't been there in over 2 decades to live. And, and my sisters, who are quite older than I am, 12 years and 14 years older than me, had already, had started a life in America. They had been, sent to schools in the US, and they grew up there. But so my parents were like, I don't feel like we should be going back to Pakistan. And again, being a kid, I wasn't really part of those discussions, but I knew that they wanted to move forward in life. And so at retirement age, without a retirement plan, my parents came to Canada to start everything all over again, for me just to go to high school. And so when I think about that, how selfless that is, how much courage it took, the risk appetite, it actually in some ways made me a bit risk averse at times, made me a bit more conservative in my decision making, because that experience for me was quite risky and a bit of a roller coaster coming here. Because as I became older, I got to learn more about how much there wasn't really a plan, and it was improv as we arrived, and it was all going to work out. It was all going to work out. My mom knew her spirit is so strong, and she's someone who just is a problem solver. So it's going to work out. But how it's going to work out is going to be an adventure. So with that, for them starting all over again, brand new careers, completely unrelated to what they were doing before, eating humble pie and starting all over again, that was the backdrop in which I sort of started to grow up here in Canada in my sort of second life. And so with that, many lessons, and again, my mom and dad made sure at all times I was very comfortable, very well looked after. But I just was privy to some of the, challenges about acclimating from finances to this, to that. And as a kid, all kids to an extent have this selfish innocence, but ignorance around believing that they're the root of the problem, or they're potentially the hero of the situation. And so inadvertently, I took on some of that stress and tension, and it kind of fueled me to become a bit more industrious and a self-starter. And so that's probably why I started pitching the real estate agent as soon as I arrived, and started, putting my talents to work to make some money. Even though there was really no pressure for me to do that, but that pressure kind of just came from within. So that was the backdrop, and that's why we moved. My mom and dad, really value education. I can imagine being South Asian and coming from South Asian parents, the education component is pretty important. So that's why we came. I went to high school here. I went to a great public high school at Yonge and Eglinton called North Toronto Collegiate. Had a great experience there. And then studied my undergrad at OCAD University, where I studied graphic design and I got a Bachelor of Design. So yeah, that's the backdrop. And
I really want to know about the what got you into design, but just before that, it would be cool to know. Do you remember any like small examples or things where you could see what was happening when you had just moved here in terms of like you described like the financial struggle or other tension? And do you remember any of those moments?
So let's see, rewinding back. So there was that aspect, but I wouldn't say that it was all consuming. It would be moments of it. And then other moments, which were great, were skateboarding. Skateboarding came with me from Dubai. I was still skateboarding when I got here. And funnily enough, when we visited on holiday in the winter of '99, I went to a skate park downtown that was called Shred Central. Doesn't exist anymore, big condo building then. It was like in an alleyway and you had to get in and whatever else. And I met two guys there in '99, and one was named Victor and another's named Fabrice. And then in 2000, when I arrived here and came here to move, I went back to that skate park and Victor and Fabrice were there. And again, this is before social media and international phone calls were expensive. There's no keeping in touch really, right? Like you just don't do that. It wasn't worth the effort. So I saw them and we started skating, and, I just got back into it. So every weekend there was skateboarding involved, whether it was on the city streets in Toronto, then there was biking and, downhill biking and all sorts of interesting things. So there was a lot of fun and activity that was happening. And the third thing was that I just wanted to create. And so I was just creating a whole bunch of things digitally. So for me, I learned about Flash and learned about ActionScript. I realized I was terrible at ActionScript, so I just stuck to visual tweening and animation and things like that. I learned I learned how websites were made, but I realized because I was a visual person, I needed to use website builder tools. So first it was Front Page, then it became Dreamweaver. And so I was just interested in making. And so I was like publishing sites and things like that. So rewinding back to that time, yes, there were these things at home and these, but there was a lot of good going on, that there was a lot of creation going on as well. So that was kind of the balance and a lot of play with skateboarding too. Yeah.
Wait, so how did you learn all these tools? Because back then there was no YouTube. And how did you, because you had to just like figure out the UI, and how did you learn the tool and make the thing? Because making the thing is one thing, but knowing how to use a tool to make that thing is a whole other chapter.
That's a great question. And I think everything so far, and it's a great question because it just triggered in me the realization that my whole career so far has been self-taught. And that is actually the key. So I was self-taught and I took an interest. I didn't have a book to read about the tool. I just opened the tool and then started to figure out how to use it and how to make things in it. And I now recently become a dad, and I can see that in my son, who's a year old now as of this weekend. He just picks things up and tries. Whereas in consulting, you discuss how you're going to try, the approach you're going to take, and then you assemble the team and everything else. And then academically, you go about the task. And at times, it works really well. But sometimes there's still an argument. Just pick up the thing and just start and just see what happens. And so, yeah, that's how I learned, and that's how I played. And it was one of those things where, you read now about being in flow state. And for me, it was, forgetting to eat because I was just so interested in what I was doing, right? I wasn't into video games and things like that. I was just into making stuff. And so, yeah, I was self-taught and tried it out and then, figured out what was working, what was not. There were a couple of times that I had some huge catastrophes, especially as a kid. A catastrophe includes accidentally deleting, formatting my entire hard drive. So and this is a shared computer. This is the home computer shared with my parents, right? So their files are gone, Windows is gone, everything's gone.
Yeah.
And you got to start again. And I did that. I overwrote files, like index.html, overwrote that thing, lost all my content. Just a whole bunch of things that I had to learn, but I had to do it all over again, and that's it.
Wow. I wonder what you learned from skateboarding that bled into the things that you are kind of doing back then, and even because there's this whole thing about skateboarding is that no matter how good you are, you're bound to fall a couple of times every time you take that skateboard out of the house.
And that's actually that's a really great observation, because relative to my friends, I noticed every few weeks, we would be at a new destination and they'd be trying to jump and ollie like a 5 set or a 3 set of stairs. And I had to work my way up to a 3 set and then really work my way up to a 5. And at that point, I knew I was done. I was like, I don't want anything bigger than this 5, because that just gave me the adrenaline boost I needed, the right amount of risk, and that's about it. But then my friends moved to 7, 10, 15. And so I would cheer them on. But there was just literally no desire in me to go any further, because there was no greater joy that I was going to receive from it. And in fact, the joy turned into fear. And then in that, for me, there was no joy. And it wasn't that fear that drives you to want to accomplish something or try something. It was just like, this isn't for me. Like I'm not gonna get any more joy out of it. So I think skateboarding taught me you got to try and try and try and try again until you get it. I couldn't ollie until the longest time, and then I was able to do it. Then I had to learn how to do it while moving. Then I had to learn how to do it on and off objects. Then the same thing with kickflips, doing it in a steady position, then moving. Same with pop shove-its, everything else. And the wonderful thing is that I think bleeds into, at least in the creative work that I was doing early on, which is just try again. And also watch and emulate. Because I got to see people who are way better than me do some amazing things, but they also did it with such grace and class and elegance, right? Like when you're, ollieing over a 5 set of stairs or off a ledge, and you're doing it with such grace and you get that air time and whatever else, I'm like, you start to internalize and visualize, wow, I'd like to be able to do it that way. Same thing in design. You look at the greats around you and you start to wonder, how did they make it? And then you start to emulate and you try to at least begin there with replication before you start to find your own style and everything else too. So I think skateboarding definitely bled into sort of the psychology and the approach. And that was a great observation. I wouldn't have connected the two.
That's really cool that you described the ollie, that first you kind of go in the grass. So the skateboard doesn't move.
And also when you do wipe out, it's a bit more, less blood.
You're like, wait, so I have to push on this side and then drag my feet up. And then you're like, how do I go up?
Yeah.
And you're right. Like when you see somebody who's mastered it and they would jump over like school bags or.
Yes. Yeah. It's a great memory. Absolutely.
So wait, the skateboard that you had, was it bent on both sides or just the classic Bart Simpson style?
It was just regular skateboard growing up. And now as an adult, again, because I just have to make sure that, I can still be a functioning adult, I have a longboard. So I cruise by the beach in Toronto and really enjoy that. And it's peaceful and I listen to music. And, I just cruise for a few kilometers at a time and I just feel like I'm floating and it's a nice, peaceful place. I still have my trick deck and I managed to corral a bunch of buddies at PwC and we've been to the skate park and the beaches. That's so cool. There's a whole bunch of fun stuff that still happens, that childhood things that come back that bring joy.
That's really cool. I'm amazed that you've still retained that part of you, that side of you. That's really cool. I was into rollerblading, skateboarding. I still have a skateboard here somewhere, and but I gave up on all of that stuff. And I used to play tennis, and then I just slowly just stuck to just cross training.
Yeah.
Running and cycling.
That's great. Those
Which
are really healthy.
The cycle back there.
It's a beautiful bike.
Yeah. it's again, similar to kind of your story growing up, we weren't like very well off. So there were like little things like, okay, so we'll eat McDonald's once on the Sunday, and couldn't pretty much afford anything because my mom probably made like, when we moved here, it was just my mom here. My dad used to be in India, and my mom made like $700 a month. So that was it. That was the whole budget. Of course, luckily my uncles allowed us to stay in their basement. So that took care of that part. It was very nice and kind of, and all thanks to them, I'm a citizen now. But with that limited budget, my mom would like take care of us, and we would eat a lot of frozen food and stuff. And and so back then, I always would look at other people who had money and be like, one day I'm going to have a projector. One day I'm going to have a bicycle, the one that I want, not like a freaking Walmart $80, $50 one. Anyway, so that's that. So this is really cool. So, skateboarding is probably the most humbling sport, so to speak, because no matter how cool you are, how good you are, you're going to wipe out.
Absolutely.
Trying anything new. And the whole fun of skateboarding is you're constantly trying new things. You're going to go off the staircase or jump onto the staircase or whatever, right? And you'd see people in downtown like putting wax on those curbs.
Yeah. Sorry, City of Toronto. I did that when I was a teenager too. So the black marks you might see in some areas, I might have done that a long time ago.
Love it. Okay. So going back to, you were creating, and you were obsessed with creating, you were learning the tools, Dreamweaver. What were you creating?
Websites. And at first it was like constantly trying to build and rebuild yousufafridi.com, which is what I used to have. And then I decided I wanted to have a company. And I thought it'd be a great idea because when I started doing my first client project, which was for the real estate agent, Nick, I thought, well, I should do this. If he was willing to pay me for it and continue to pay me for maintenance afterwards, because he wanted these continual updates and things like that, which again I thought it'd be a one-time thing. But then he's like, no, I need to maintain this. I want new content up there. So I was like, oh, maybe I could do this for other people. Maybe he can introduce me to other people. And lo and behold, he did. And so I was like, okay, I need a company. And so I was trying to come up with a company name, and I was brainstorming. It was actually my sister in New York. And she's like, Yousuf, you're trying to work on these different things, and maybe you should go with something like Design Concepts. And so I was like, okay, that's a great name. Like I can work with that. It's broad enough and everything else. And then of course, no domain name, no designconcepts.com. It's taken, dconcepts taken, everything else taken. And this is 2000. So you can imagine the mess out there right now, right? And so I was like, okay, I did the thing that all startups do today, which is I misspelt it. So I spelt it DEZINE, and then that was it. So, in high school, I started this little company, and what I was able to do as services was I would burn CDs for my friends, and I'd get money doing that. That was the school. Then for the real estate client, I had websites that I was building. Then he introduced me to other people where I built websites and business cards and brochures. And then when I got into university, I kept doing it, but then I started getting other clients, including restaurants and bars in the College Street West area, because that's where I lived with my parents. And so I started doing their promo flyers and things like that. And so I was making money by using my talent and interest in creation. So now I'm in Adobe Creative Suite. I'm using Illustrator. I'm using Photoshop. I am still using Flash. I am still using Dreamweaver. I'm going to print studios to actually go look at paper and see proofs. All these things I had to learn through trial and error. And I've had wonderful people who took interest in me all along the way to encourage me and enable me, even at the print shop. I still remember his name. His name was Bobby. And he would be like, Yousuf, like, I can't believe, you're a teenager and you got clients and you're doing this print run. They're like 3,000 things you're printing, and it's pretty custom and dye lines and this and that. And he's like, just come to the print shop. I just knew this guy over an email, and I went in and I saw the print studio and like saw the machines and everything else. And he explained stuff to me, and he's like, always do something called a test run. And so he showed me what a test run is. He's like, now take this to your client and get them to sign it to say that it's okay. Because that way you're not on the hook if the print run goes bad. They signed off on the colors, the typography, on the content. So people were teaching me along the way, sort of some of these business principles and things like that. So I was very lucky, but it was all driven from just an interest of doing it. So I started that company. I still have it. Like I still operate some of my private consulting things that don't conflict with my main job under that banner. And PwC, I do get approval for moonlighting, so don't worry. So yeah, that's still around.
That is fantastic. Wait, you described all of this as a teenager. How old were you?
15.
15 years old?
Yeah.
Holy smokes.
I started, the first paid client was at 14 when I first moved here. And then design concepts started when I was 15.
Okay. How did you, not convince, but how did you sell to the first client?
It happened because I was sitting in Nick's car with my parents, and he was driving us to different properties to take a look at. And he gave me his business card, and I went home and I noticed he had a website address on it. So I looked it up, and I thought basically it just wasn't that great. It was kind of generic. And it was at an interesting time because he was part of a real estate brokerage, and he was going out on his own. And he had shown me some of the things that he was going to do. And he's like, oh, I just had this, made by the print shop locally. And I said, I do design. Like, I actually can make this for you. He's like, well, show me what you can do, right? And so I auditioned for it. And I put something together for free. And he's like, I'll pay you for this. And I was like, okay. And he's like, here's $300. As a kid, $300 was a lot. And he came up with that number. I didn't pitch him or anything like that. And so that helped me with establishing my price card and my rate card. So websites for anywhere between 300 to 500. And then, business cards and everything were add-ons, and flyers were one-offs and things like that. And so, I auditioned for it by showing him what I could do and what I would do. And he took interest in it, and he said, yeah, let's make it real. And then I showed him how to register a domain name, and then showed him how to register for hosting, and showed him 3 different options for hosting for different price points and different features. And that was it. And then I created the stuff and uploaded it, and that was it. And then it was live. And then that was it. And then he started referring me to people, which I had mentioned earlier. And that was another lesson. You do good work, and people will bring other people to you. And I think that's also playing into current day, where there's sales, which is something you could teach me about, is an art and a craft. But so far, my style has been around delivery, and with great delivery comes advocacy, and with advocacy comes more work and more opportunity as well. And so that lesson still plays into today as well.
That's such a fantastic story. I'm just trying to imagine that state where you guys are driving around, like there's like this 15-year-old kid, and he just comes out of nowhere. He's like, yeah, your website sucks.
It actually was a very diplomatic way of me saying exactly that. Like, and I literally said, I could do better for you. You could do better, and let me try. And and then anyway, through 2 internships were pivotal in teaching me more about the business of design. The first one was when I was in high school. In my second last year of high school, I wasn't eligible to do a co-op program. And my guidance counselor and the teacher saw some of these things that I was doing. Like, I told them, like, hey, you don't let me do design work at school. You make me do traditional artwork. So here's some of the things I'm doing digitally. And they're like, holy, wow, this is actually good stuff. Like maybe you should do a co-op at a design studio. I'm like, what's that? And so she's like, oh, no, these are companies that actually do design work for clients. And you could do this like on a daily basis and see how other professionals do it. I was like, okay, cool. I'm, again, innocent. I don't know what it's like. She found a studio called Galaxy Media. Their clients were Danier Leather, Puma, so very cool. They had a photography studio. They had a head of design, and I'm still in touch with that head of design today. He's a personal friend of mine. His name's Jules McCusker. He was the creative director of the studio, and I came in there, and I was meant to be in there for an interview, and I was told it'd be 45 minutes at Queen and Bathurst in the early 2000s, and my parents parked their minivan on Bathurst Street waiting for me to complete this interview. So I went in there for 45 minutes. I came out 4 hours later. During that interview, we just started talking about all things design. He started to show me, I was asking so many questions. He showed me how he produced his artwork files because he showed me all his print work and all the stuff he had done for Puma and all this really cool stuff. I was like, how did you do that? How did you film this thing and how did you edit it? He's like, oh, I use this thing called Final Cut Pro. I'm like, oh my God, like not iMovie and, not Premiere because I had a PC at the time. And he's like, no, let me show you how to do it. And so for 4 hours, we were just talking all things design, video editing. And he had like all the latest Mac gear too, which blew my mind, right? Like I'd never seen such a big cinema display and such cool stuff. Like thousands and thousands of dollars of tech. And he's like, okay, so when can you start? I'm like, I don't know. Ask my guidance counselor. I don't know how this works. And so I ended up going there, I think it was 2 times a week. And it was only meant to be for like whatever, 2 hours a day or something. But I just spent my summer there. And then I started doing work for them on the side. And then Jules tried to convince me not to go to university and just work for him. It didn't work out. He lost that battle, and my parents were definitely not letting that happen. But that was such a pivotal experience. He taught me about how to charge, like what appropriate fees were. He told me not to call myself a creative director because I had 1 minute of experience, and like all sorts of lessons. And he, taught me how to socialize with clients. I was a young kid. He took me out to the coolest parties on Queen Street and everything else. And they printed a business card for me. And my title was The Kid. And everybody knew me as The Kid in the industry. So I got to work on real brand, like real clients, real brands, real stuff. Unfortunately, other co-op students didn't have the same experience as me. They were putting glycerin dots on Amsterdam Brewery bottles to make them look like they sweat so that they could take photos, because there was a photo studio. They were doing really boring work. In contrast, very important, but very boring. I got to work on real client stuff, go show up at the client sites with Jules. He taught me how not to dress the way I was dressing in high school, and so many other things too. He really took me under his wing, and I credit him with so much, and he's still in my life and plays a very big role.
This shows that because you were already proactive and already passionate about something, he just sniffed it out.
Yeah, he did. And he knew how to nurture it and give me space to do it, and give me stretch opportunities, and just let me try things. And sometimes to his own detriment, he gave me too much space and latitude. And then some of his clients were like, no, just send the kid. And so I actually made friends with some of his clients. And after he shut down the studio, I took on one of their biggest clients as my own, Fashion Cares for the AIDS Committee of Toronto, which was an awesome thing. Which then later, and fast forward a few years, I was in my first full-time design job, and we rebranded the AIDS Committee of Toronto, which is down the street, and the branding is still on the building. It's still part of their entire visual vocabulary. That was work I had done. So those early relationships, those early experiences, that delivering good quality, and that leading to organic sales, that led to me bringing in work as a brand new employee to a very well established design boutique. So it all kind of worked out, and it was all organic. It was all self-taught, and I just had the right environment and the right people. Without that, I don't think any of this would have happened.
this would, I'm guessing, be your first experience working with, let's say, a boss and a leader. And like you said, he kind of took you under his wing. He became kind of your mentor. Are there things about his leadership style, his approach to treating you and people around him that you still apply to yourself today?
One thing I observed was that I think there were two different kinds of relationship in one person. The first was around getting to know me and helping me with my life and my ambitions and trying to channel that into work. And the second was helping me with my craft. And I think there were always two different conversations and two different settings. We could be out for lunch, or he would take me out in the evening or whatever else, take me out to a party. We're talking about life and we're talking about career and talking about, goals. But when we're in the studio and we're making, he's helping me with my craft. And having two different narratives, I think, are very important, and not to confuse the two. Because just because I make a mistake or in my craft, or I'm not able to really achieve something in my craft, doesn't take away from his relationship with me as a person and what my ambition is. And he doesn't confuse the two. And so I think I've been emulating that. And I've also been lucky that so far I've had some very good leaders in each of these companies. Each of them actually kind of in one way or the other took me under their wing. In fact, one of them flew me around the US with his race team, because he had a design studio and a car racing team. And spending so much time with him taught me so much about, life and the business of creativity and client relationships. You don't kind of get that if you're just at work from 9 to 5 and you're just talking about the work that needs to be done and the context of it and the challenges. So I've tried to take an interest in people who want to be coached, and the team that I have, you get to choose who your coach is. And I encourage them to change their coach each year so they get to learn something different based on their goals. And so for anyone who has chosen me, that's kind of the approach. There are material conversations about their craft and what they're doing, how to get unstuck and how to overcome hurdles and how to navigate through bureaucracy and politics, and how to become more self-aware of how their reactions influence a room, or lack of contribution influences the room. But then there are also times about, like, what do you want to be as you continue to grow? And I'm not tied to the fact that they have to grow within the organization. I will find ways and be honest about how the organization can enable a percentage of that, but where they'll need to seek fulfillment and challenge outside of work as well, and find that balance. And at some time, you may have to graduate from PwC or wherever to then find that next experience, because the place can't give you everything all the time. So yeah, that, to answer it succinctly, 2 tracks: coaching on the craft, and then, professional coaching around what you want to become, and using different tactics, settings to do both.
That's really cool. And it's funny that you got exposed to it so early on. And so since you described that you were going to these client meetings, you're kind of like this, I don't know how much of a talking role you had back then, and I find that funny that they gave you the title of the kid. It reminds me of the movie The Karate Kid. But when you were a fly in the wall, when you were experiencing, did you notice anything specific about his style when he was talking to clients, how he would deal with them? And I'm guessing you were just, because you were, the way you described it, you were absorbing everything like a sponge. Any instances or stories you remember from back then that spoke to you or that were client facing?
He has such a charisma, and he's a great storyteller. And he was able to lead the room, and people would listen, and they would really lean in. And that's what I watched. Like, people be quiet. There's no fidgeting. He's presenting his creative, whatever the campaign was or the vision was, whatever the project was, lights go down, he's talking about it, has a great introduction. This is a whole story arc that he has thought about. And then suddenly he's able to switch into, okay, so that was the creative. Let's talk about the production and execution of it. Here's the nitty-gritty details that we're going to have to account for. And then when the clients were like, well, I don't know if this is going to be done on time and this and that, and he would be able to negotiate and be like, do something well and do something right. What is 1 or 2 days of delay on a campaign that, will set an impression and with your end users and customers? Like, he was very good at negotiation. He was very good at storytelling. He could switch into the language of business every once in a while and speak their speak. And he talked simply enough that they were empowered to critique and talk about design without having for it to become something that was very technical or very, I would say, aloof or, artistic. So he did a very good job at bridging that. So that was something I observed, and I actually observed that in my second leader as well at Compass 360. His name was Carl Thompson, and his business partner was John Cook. Both of them were very good at this. You could be talking to your designers and your creative folk in extreme creative talk, like a separate language altogether. And then you could switch to your client audience and speak to them in their language. That was fascinating. And then the second part of all that, like 2 languages, and the second part of it was these tough questions. Like questions I would consider tough even now. Can't think of an example, but I just felt, I was like, whoa, what is the answer to that question? How do you even begin answering that question? And the context as a teenager is like in school, when you don't know the answer, you don't put your hand up, right? Like the person who knows the answer puts their hand up and then they give the answer. You don't have an option to not have an answer. You have to have an answer. So that improv that I observed, or the tactic of, which I learned much later, is like, that's a great question. Let me get back to you. Here's what I know so far, but here's what I need to go figure out. Just to instill some confidence that I understand what you mean. I know why you're asking it. Let me go find something out. I have an inkling of what it'll be, but I'm not going to commit until I give you some information that is actually valuable to you. So those are the things I got to observe in like early days and even in the boardrooms of the boutique companies that I work for and the ad agencies as well, which is a whole other sort of show altogether, big scale.
As you were describing how they would be able to play this game of improv, kind of the yes and, as the client would throw a curveball at you and you're able to handle those questions. I think there's one pride that creative people take is their ability to problem solve in the moment. I think that's one I've just noticed with certain creative people, that as they're presenting, they're doing this sort of wowing the client and handling all kind of feedback. Of course, one thing that I sort of noticed personally with my specific mentors and I don't know what your specific experiences was. And this parlays into sort of the education thing that you were talking about, school. In school, you were always rewarded for having the right answer. But I think in our role and where we're today, let's say, and especially when you're in those client-facing situations, it's about the person who's asking the most highest resolution question. That tells you more about their skill level, their expertise, versus the actual answer.
What a great observation. You're right. Now more than ever, in the context that you and I operate in, the question being asked is actually extremely important. Because you're right, it actually is a window into the mind of the person and an understanding of the full context. The framing of the question is actually extremely important. I wouldn't have thought of that, and you're absolutely right. Especially in the context of consulting, what we find ourselves doing more often than not, and this actually, my first observation wasn't even in consulting, was in the advertising world, is when we would actually reframe what would be the the marketing insight from the marketing plan the client would give us, how do you reframe that as a creative problem or a creative insight that would resonate with the audiences that we were actually trying to reach? And the reframing could just be taking, a square and rotating it and calling it a diamond, like we did with Diamond Shreddies once upon a time, which was a brilliant campaign.
Brilliant.
But that subtlety, you're absolutely right, is a talent, and extremely valuable. But it's also it's like a game of squash. I play squash. You can hit some really thoughtful tactical shots to move your opponent into the corner. But when your opponent hits you those shots, you got to have to return that shot back to them. So if you're going to ask those thoughtful questions and frame them well, you're absolutely right in the sense that creative people also have the ability to problem solve on the spot too, and navigate through that, unpack that question, break it down into smaller pieces, turn it into a conversation, and then lead to a different destination potentially.
Yeah, in my experiences because I started out with I was just drawing all the time, and my parents, and I was really bad at studies. Long story short is, because I was really bad at studies and just really good at drawing and art, my parents were like, you know what, when you go to high school, just pick whatever you're comfortable with, because it's so stressful for them. So I ended up going to arts college, and then after that I got into this advertising program, and that's where I first discovered what I'm really good at. And it was a program started by an advertising agency called Lowe Lintas. Lowe is worldwide,
yep.
Mullen Lowe, and at the time there it was called Lintas, and it was acquired by IPG Lowe, and all that blah 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 stuff happened. But there we were taught by practitioners, and practitioners would come in and do like a workshop with us and give us the skills of problem solving, what kind of questions to ask, what kind of stakeholders to think about it from different altitudes of that same problem. So you see it in a slightly different way. And so that really shaped my early days. And what I learned was that the person asking the best questions was the person guiding the conversation and leading the room, not the person with just doing all the talking. The person asking the question and just shut up. Of course, I'm not the best at it. Always trying to improve at that. But that's where I kind of learned these initial skills of, okay, ask better questions, ask more questions, ask why you're trying to do this. And okay, so now kind of going back with the whole question pieces, typically you have noticed, and this is going to perfectly parlay into your experiences of starting your own business and then also going to school for it, but then getting exposed by this mentor to now you've got into Compass as well. You talked about that experience. The client is going to come to you with a self-diagnosed sort of solution. And they might not even have necessarily the best finger on the right problem, and they probably haven't even defined the problem in the right way. So, and one thing I've observed with agencies, I'm not blanket statement for all agencies, people are going to hate me, is that agencies are typically approach it like a vendor and just tell us what to do. Or it's more on the lines of, okay, we need to promote this product. Okay, let's just start figuring out what the ad campaign is going to be and how we promote this. Whereas with my experiences of Lowe and that whole piece, and then getting into consulting, and might be true for you as well, is that in consulting, they ask more questions. They really get into like the strategic part of, okay, why are you trying to make this ad? Why this ad now? What's the sales? Typically, agencies never ask about, okay, what's your top line, bottom line? What's the cost of the product? What are your margins? Because they're not really into value-based pricing. They're typically into time and materials, or a retainer. Whereas consulting gets into like these really creative ways of pricing, which could be value-based, outcome-based, or revenue share models. So long-winded way of saying is, the thinking that instigates that question, curiosity, is not necessarily found in agencies. I don't know what your experience has been.
I can tell you a bit about what I observed in the early days, and then so at Compass, and then what I observed when I was at Taxi, which was both were great experiences for me. At Compass, the self-diagnosed common request would be the client would come to the partners of Compass and say, "I need a website," and they would leave that meeting saying, "Thanks, guys. I need a brand. I didn't know I needed a brand. We were a branding agency, corporate branding boutique. So, of course, we're going to sell a brand." And turning a website, which could have been, again, this is early 2000, right? So we were paying big money, right, for beautiful custom-made stuff. You know, turning what they thought would be like a $60,000 or $80,000 website project into a $300,000 branding project or reinvention project. That's the type of work. So they were really good at helping clients realize they don't have a website problem, but a branding problem. How you look, the mind share you own, the positioning, how that is all going to manifest visually, the longevity of that, how that means you're going to have to influence how you deliver your service offering, from the packaging of your services to the way your call centers pick up your phone. All of that is going to have to evolve and change because of this work. So that was where I learned how to like turn the square into a diamond. You know, the whole that whole notion came from observing I need a website to know you need a brand. And then at Taxi, I was working at Taxi 2, which is a brand new digital agency that they stood up because TELUS was a taxi. Kudo, the value brand, was a Taxi 2. And so it was all digital related projects that we were working on. And I was on the digital side, as they used to call it back then. And I got to work with some really, really smart planners and account planners, I guess are called strategists. And they were asking those questions. And I got to see them now, because I spent so much time with creatives up until that point. And now I'm being introduced to this kind of mutated role of like, you clearly are creative, but you've got this business brain too. And you kind of understand marketing and metrics and measurement, but you can reframe things and you're really articulate and you're a really good writer as well. Like, this was a new kind of mutant I hadn't met before. And they were the ones who were starting to tease these things out. And I was like, and again, going through my career, I observed different people and different roles. And I was like, I want to be doing more of that. How do I get to do more of that? And so that was the curiosity thing. So I spent more time with them and started to learn the vocabulary and start to ask similar questions, and then start to reposition and pivot my own career so I could do more of that kind of work. I didn't want to just do that full time, because at the end of the day, what did they make? They made briefs, creative briefs. It's like a menu at a restaurant. It's so important, but the menu itself is a reflection of all the operational cost considerations and everything else that restaurant owner went into. The brief is like the purest essence of what the creative strategy should and could be and what the whole thing can become. But then it's up to the creative teams to manifest that and invent from there, and then to see how it will perform in market and everything else. So for me, I was more interested in like, how can I go soup to nuts, like the whole thing. I wanted to go from like insight to like activation and market, right? So anyway, in other words, yes, I observed that, and my experience, I could peer through a window and see those questions being asked, but I never saw it to the extreme in the way that you pointed, which in consulting is a whole other realm that impacts front office, middle office, back office. You talk to a client and they want to, I don't know, launch a new product line or a new service offering. And suddenly you realize through the questioning and the assessment period and everything else that what they're really looking for is new revenue. But what they could be doing is optimizing an existing line for new margins to operate differently and source things differently or whatever else. And so we end up doing a project there. And then we'll help with another project around innovation, perhaps, that will help with new sources of revenue and new service offerings or like add-ons, etc., and help them invent and quantify that, where to play, how to win, all that sort of stuff. So you're right, because it's like marketing and advertising was one layer, and then in consulting, it's all the layers. And it blew my mind. It really blew my mind, and it's been such a amazing learning experience for me. And I know lots of people spend a lot of money on MBAs, and there's probably a lot of people who have derived value from it. But because I'm a person who's self-taught and learns by doing, this was the environment that I achieved an honorary MBA, quite frankly, by just being there and being around these people and working on really interesting projects and problems. So yeah, I'd say I had a bit of exposure to that, and I continue to, and I think it's really shaped my thinking.
Yeah, I think the part where you started working in the real world and you were not just focused on just this, I got to make this digital thing. You were going talking to the printer, you were talking to clients, you were understanding their problem. So all those skills were being developed at a very, very early formative years for you. But the analogy that fits perfectly is when I started drinking coffee for the first time, it was primarily boiled milk with a spoon of coffee and 2 spoons of sugar. And then from there, at some point, you get to a latte. Then you get to a cappuccino. Then you get to a cortado. Then you get to an Americano. And then you get to pour overs and black coffee, which we're having now.
Yeah.
And that's basically a career of a creative person. You start off with, unless you want to be like an IC, individual contributor, is you start off with, okay, I want to create something. You start with like posters or a website. And then you're like, okay, at some point you're like, oh wait, I'm managing a team of people. I'm coaching them. And at some point, instead of selling what you can do or what your team can do, let's say if you're a branding shop, we're just going to try and sell rebrand and branding, versus and when you get to this evolved state of consulting, which is they sit at the executive level, not at the CMO level or the marketing department, or they're not limited to what we can do. They're thinking from the whole perspective of, let's step into the shoes of the business owner. We're not doing it to them. We're doing it with them. And they're going to be like, so what problem do you have? Okay, let's help you find some new revenue first. And then that's going to pay for what we want to do next. So they're really like collaborating and saying, okay, how can we leave you better with where we start? I mean, of course, consulting gets a lot of bad rep and bad name for, oh, there's all these beautiful presentations and blah, blah, blah. But my experiences of consulting has been in that fashion. So I started off my career as, full milk, 2 spoons of sugar, to now having this black coffee. And so in your side of the things, because you were working with clients at a very early age, and then you were learning as you were going along, what were your experiences like working on for yourself first, which you still do, to then working in an agency, seeing how they sold things, and then how in consulting things are sold? How has that experience been for you?
In a place where, in the current context where I work at PwC, the conversations and the relationships with clients are at a pretty senior level, executive level. And that was a material shift for me from when I was in the advertising agency world, or even when I was out on my own, before joining PwC. The type of conversation and the limited time that you get with people who are COOs, sometimes CFOs, sometimes CEOs, is a whole other board game. It's almost at times, and depending on the, I'm talking about these major corps, large size organizations. For those, there seems to be preparation upon preparation upon preparation. because somebody's been briefed about something, the chief of staff, then the chief of staff gets in touch with us, and we're talking and we're learning about the situation, but we've got tentacles throughout the organization already, so we're getting intel and information from all those other angles. And then, at the partnership level, these people are either well respected and have either worked with one another in the past, or they could be acquaintances. And so when we are making an approach, it's usually a pretty well-informed approach because we have information, because we have experience with them. We know what's keeping them up at night. We understand what's happening in the market or in their industry. We also then have intel about what's happening globally in that industry with competitors. So there's no shortage of ways to start a conversation with them that actually delivers some material value. But I also have observed that if you are in a position to listen rather than go in and pitch your credentials, you're going to have a much better outcome, even though the sales cycle may be a hell of a lot longer. And it's always great to build a relationship when they aren't necessarily looking for something. Because once you get into RFPs, we know how much work RFPs are. It takes a mission. It's a lot of work for the organization to craft an RFP and then to, pass through them. But it's a ton of work for all the other organizations competing for that RFP as well. And ultimately, it comes down to approach and relationships, but it comes down to price when it's RFP. So if possible, with relationships, where possible as well, where it's not something that's going to be misconstrued in the eyes of the public as favoritism or whatever, it's always good to have a relationship to begin with listening and to then provide some tangible, valuable advice, at times for free in conversation, for them to try out. Kind of like when you think about what I did with Nick in real estate, kind of gave him something to respond to and react to see the value in it. And then from there, a relationship was formed and many great things came from it as well. So today, an approach, of course, is the formal RFP route, which I won't bore anyone with over here. But I think through delivery, which is something, that's been the best way for me to maintain relationships with my clients, to be asked back by name by federal clients, by provincial clients. That has been the ultimate reward for me of recognition, is when I've been asked back with my team because of what we had done and delivered. And in one instance, we actually did not win the work because I was not available with the team to take that work on. They gave it to someone else. And that really reinforced, it was a moment for me where I felt I was accepted and I had made it in this consulting realm because of the imposter syndrome associated being a designer masquerading around as a management consultant. But because I'm self-taught and I had all the skills along the way, I just needed to see how it was done, to have a good environment, to have good leadership. And believe me, I can teach myself a lot of things. And I felt confident enough and I believed in myself that I could do it. So I think sales through delivery is key, and sales through listening and providing some authentic advice is giving. Don't give if you're expecting to receive. Just give something and be authentic about it too. That's been my style so far. And remember, we don't go at it alone at PwC for anything. It's a team. Anytime we're approaching a client, because of those questions that might get asked, or because we might as a team need to reframe the question that is being discussed. So you never go at it alone. You always bring people in from a different area of practice. We go in together and we team. That's the best value you can actually deliver.
I love that. So there's two things that you described, and I'm going to unpack one of those. When you're in consulting versus when you're in a marketing or creative agency or brand agency. In consulting, you go in for the client, they experience like, okay, what does this person know about my space, my industry, my company, my pod, my business unit?
Well said. They're looking for that credibility.
So they're looking for somebody who gets it. And I think the biggest difference because we've evolved from individual, doing our own thing to agencies to consulting is in agencies and in branding studios, and a lot of the work stems from business brief and creative brief. In consulting, you're helping make the business case. So one is driven by the business case, which is shaped with the client, whereas advertising agencies, because they're naturally order takers, are working with business briefs and creative briefs. I think that's the biggest difference, which is like, if you think about the butterfly effect, when you're shaping the business case with them, you're thinking about outcomes and impact, and you're thinking, okay, how are we going to get there? How are we going to take you there? Whereas an agency is thinking, we got a business brief. Okay, now let's translate this into a creative brief, or what the planners are going to do. And they get into like solution mode. Whereas consultants think about, okay, how do we make the case for this? How do we find the budget for this? How do we find the right teams for this? And so on and so on.
That's a very astute observation. And what's also interesting is in consulting, at times we're helping the executive teams prepare for board meetings. So we go even higher. And that is the oxygen level is completely different up there, right? And I got to tell you that that's a great observation. And again, I don't want listeners to feel that you're discrediting the agency world, because there's a whole industry out there and they're doing great work.
Fuck advertising agencies. Get into consulting. Just kidding. By the way, I don't want to come off as, I am hating on agencies and stuff. It's just that they live at different altitudes. And of course, like, we discussed earlier, consulting gets shit on a lot.
It does.
And so do agencies, and so do whatever.
Absolutely.
But it's just that, as in our careers, and we've had not identical, but very echoes, a similar kind of whatever, is that these are the differences I've noticed. And I'm like, now I'm hooked to consulting. I can't go backwards now. It feels like going backwards when I'm like, fuck.
Is there a play for a transformation of some agencies? Do you think there's space for a combination of agency and consultancy? That was something that was obviously discussed a lot many years ago. And then we started to see consultancies acquire either agencies or software shops, Deloitte with TWG, for example, or Fjord being acquired by Accenture. This was many years ago. But if someone was starting an agency today, do they make it a consultancy? And what's your worldview on that? You've spent more time in agencies as well, and have talked to people in agencies more recently than I have. Where do they stand today in your view, and could they move upstream?
Firstly, I want to say that, this is just like that from the milk coffee to the black coffee. It's an evolution. Not only, from maturing as a person and getting into the space that you're in, but as you sort of mature in your career, you also want to have much more higher resolution conversations. So, as you reach a certain point, a new door opens up. And so, at first you just want to learn the software and a new feature. And you're like, oh, this opened up this door. Now I can do this thing and I can automate this thing. And then it's like, okay, next stage and next stage. And then you get to a point where you're like, okay, now how do we go talk to a CEO and get funding approved for like this $300 million thing?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the journey, and what it's like to be on boots on the ground. And now you can actually have empathy for that CEO, because now you're thinking about the totality of the whole thing, and you're thinking about the business side of things, and you're really truly stepping into the shoes of the client and not just tell me what to do. So that's kind of where we left off, ladies and gentlemen. And
so one observation on that is that I do believe that some agencies are moving in the direction of swimming upstream and succeeding at having different types of conversations. I know more recently, at least in Canada, Cossette has a new chief creative officer. His name is Sabah. I know him quite well. And what's actually very interesting about him being a chief creative officer is that he's a MBA and a creative and an entrepreneur, and has had his own agency in the past as well. So now you've put a business-minded creative leader in place as the highest peak in that industry, in that context, to drive different kind of outcomes for that agency. And any type of mission like that will take time. It just happened recently that he got appointed, but I'm interested to see how that might evolve the culture, the offerings, and ultimately the types of conversations and work that come out of it. In fact, what will happen potentially, and this is just a theory, is that agencies, if they do succeed at moving upstream, will do less visible work. Because most of the work that consultants do is invisible. The ultimate beneficiary are the people who interact, like consumers and customers and shareholders. But the work that we do, unless it's like something that also includes a go-to-market thing and everything else, is largely invisible. So this is also interesting cultural shift. I would say that an agency would potentially do more consulting like work, would be producing more decks as deliverables rather than more campaigns and branded outputs. So that's a whole different shift, and it's a spectrum, so from internal to external. And I'd be curious to see in time to come, and I'll look at Cassette as an example to see if that's the direction it may go in. But it would be interesting. I've seen consultancies like Deloitte as well invest heavily to bring all those talents in-house, right? Build massive design teams, build and bring in software expertise. So there is something there. There is something there where the intersection of the two can coexist and should coexist, but where and how it might manifest itself, I think time will tell.
You're right. There are companies and agencies that are trying to move upstream. And of course, the dollar amounts change. The person you're talking to changes. The quality of questions and conversation you're having is different. Having said all this and what we just talked about, I think there is definitely a requirement for the agencies that exist, because you still need the people who can, execute, take orders. If, let's say, for example, like a simple example is like, let's say an event has to happen. A lot of stuff needs to be made. So you still need the vendors, so to speak, versus partners, which I would say are mostly consulting. But there's a big difference. I think we have to also consider the incentive and the cost associated. So a consulting firm will be like 16,000 people, 15,000 people. The deal size will be 30 million, 300 million, 500 million. So they can actually say, you know what, we can actually invest 5 million, 10 million, and take the time to understand the client, the business case, and build that business case, and then sell them that transformation project. Whereas an agency, the budgets are so much smaller. They can't have that kind of resources allocated to listening, understanding the client, building those business cases, because they don't have that kind of runway to absorb those kind of costs. So sure, it's nice to think about it from that lens of upstream. Maybe it's like if it's like a really lean outfit and you have like low overheads and you have these big buildings and rentals and all that stuff for the agency. And when you go on the other side, you have these large consulting that can absorb that cost from a sales perspective.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely that piece that comes to mind when you're describing that, even though agencies are trying to talk to, and a lot of times agencies don't have that skill set of talking to executives of, okay, what kind of questions do we ask? Because they're not spending the time that it takes to learn about, and so there's a huge skill gap. The incentive, the cost, there's all these factors.
Yeah, you're right. There are actually a number of potential barriers to entry and success that would have to be addressed. Yeah, you're right. It'd have to be thought through.
That, and then in addition, a lot of the agency people who are like leading these big agencies, especially in North America, they're like, business is doing well. Why break something that's already doing really well? So the change piece is another big aspect. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, to say, long story short, for order takers, vendors, there's a long way to go. And there's a lot of things that need to be addressed before they can actually get to that point. But that shouldn't stop people from being more curious. And I think the simplest way for me to describe typical agencies with consulting is one stays curious and one jumps to conclusions.
That's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, because it's like, okay, the client's given us this brief. Okay, now let's start figuring out how we're going to pitch to them. And it's all about the pitch, and it's all about like, what do you call it? Smokes and mirrors, and sometimes, and again, I would say that's the philosophical bucket in which that piece lives. Whereas in consulting, of course, there's smokes and mirrors and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But depending at what level of the consulting practice you're working with, there's lesser and lesser tolerance for bullshit. They'll be like, wait. And I'm really thankful that, at Deloitte, the people that I look up to that are my mentors, and they're constantly pushing me to be a better version of me. And I remember my first instance at a big consulting firm, and I'm in a big boardroom, and it's overlooking the Toronto skyline. It's like the 19th floor. And there's all these senior executives, senior partners, and all this. And then the person that I report to. And one of the senior guys gets up and he's like, yeah, so this transformation, $300 million RFP, and he's talking blah, blah. And then this guy that I look up to, and he's my mentor also. He doesn't know who I am, but he is my mentor. He just gets up and he's like, by the way, I've understood nothing. Can somebody speak to me like I'm in grade 5? And I was like, what the fuck? That you can do that? Like what?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, the client doesn't speak like this. This is all our internal language. We're not going to use this language.
Wonderful.
We're going to speak to them in their voice. And that's really that first experience that I had. And I was hooked from that day.
Wow. That is
zero tolerance for bullshit.
That is a great experience. And that is a great reframe and a great humbling of that room. Absolutely. There are times that I get reminded of this when new team members join my team. They're doing their orientation, everything else, and suddenly when in a lunch conversation and we're talking about this client, that situation, that, and suddenly we've just spat out 96 acronyms, and they at lunch are like, I understood about 4% of what you guys said, and you suddenly realize, shit, we're talking like them. We're talking to each other in our own custom language that we've invented. Let's bring it back down to earth. And my organic experience that relates to yours was in my first few weeks. I actually created a note on my computer called acronyms, and I actually had to ask people what does that mean, and I had started writing them down. And then we hired an executive creative director, John Finkelstein, who came in from the agency world to become our first ECD at PwC. And I immediately felt a connection, and we get along well. And because we both came from, a similar background, and we were now on this, strange planet together. And we were sitting in a meeting much like that. And then he messages me on chat. He's like, what are they talking about? And I wrote back, I have no fucking idea. And that was it. And so, but very quickly now, John talks to the CEO, PwC, and other CEOs fluently in business jargon, whatever else, marries it into creative jargon, and makes some pretty remarkable things happen. And that's where I've seen the power of that, the creative force actually working within consultancy. I think it's very difficult for creatives, from an identity perspective, unless there is a community that they can look to one another to coexist in a consultancy that's filled typically with, you know, a different kind of culture. They're the subculture within it, right? The creativity has to be explained. The design and the value of design has to be explained. And you can imagine if you could work somewhere else, like an agency, for example, where you are valued and everything else, and then you come into a place where you have to kind of defend your value all the time and express what your value is and learn the language of the business, it could become a bit challenging and tiring. So it takes a very special kind of creative person to be able to adapt in that environment, leave space for creativity, create community, still be connected to the outside creative community, but then add a lot of value in a business context and everything else as well. So I really commend the creatives that do come into the consulting world and also find a way to acclimate and add value, because part of their responsibility, the successful ones, is to learn the language of business and to start speaking in a common language in and around there on top of their craft, and then breaking their craft down into very easy, simple, digestible things, like you said in that boardroom in your example, that, you know, a 15-year-old would understand or a 5-year-old would understand. Because that's kind of the only way we'll find common ground and agree to things. Using analogies is a very good tactic all the time. You used one today, which I thought was very helpful and very illustrative. So it's work for both parties, and it takes an open mind for traditional consultants, partners who run practices who've been there for 15, 20 years before design was a function that we had, to now learn a new language and everything else. But I give full credit to them because they're in the business of reinventing themselves and reinventing the company continually in order to be around for another 100 years. They've been here for 100, they got to be around for another 100. That's one of the beautiful things about why I think I'm still in consulting. I have never chosen to be in a place for 6.5 years before. 3 years, and I feel I've outgrown the place or outpaced the place, or the thing that I want to learn next isn't accessible to me in that place. Therefore, I must find it somewhere else. I've had 2, if not 3 different pivots within PwC itself. And I've watched other partners who've grown up there do the same thing. Move from assurance to consulting, from risk to there, from a risk partner to become the head of innovation, digital and data, and really move the needle for the whole entire firm. It's like, whoa, okay, you can reinvent yourself well into late in your career. That's really motivating, that the environment let you do it or gave you the space to do it. It also gives you the space, also so much space that if you mess up, you're out, right? So it's just if you have a self-starting spirit, if you are an entrepreneur at heart, it's a really good place to be. But if you feel that you need certainty and ambiguity is not really a place of comfort, or if you just need some sort of repetitive thing to do, there are very few functions like that and roles within functions that exist. If you really want to get the most out of it, it's kind of these people that are kind of generalists that become specialists over time and then can reposition themselves. And so I feel career-wise, at this moment in time, it's been a really good place overall.
What was your perception of consulting before joining, and then what was it like in that first year?
Even throughout the interview process, Paul, I had no idea what they did. What does a consultancy do? My mother-in-law still asks, "What do you do?" And I still look at my wife and she says, "He's a this." I'm like, I haven't done that in 6 years. And I'm like, so I didn't really understand what they did. I didn't understand. Like, my friend who I'm going to meet after this interview said, "Yousuf, you got to go in and just meet the partnership. I know you've started your own company again. Like, just go meet." I'm like, Chris, you at my launch party and you want me to come in for an interview at a company and shut this thing down? He's like, just do it. It's like, okay, fine. Because you're my friend and I trust you and I value your perspective. I'm going to go do it. And so they're asking me like, so Yousuf, like, what do you do? What can you do? Have you done? I'm like, I've done this, I've done that. They're like, you've done so many things. Like, what are you good at? How would you fit in here? I'm like, well, what do you do? I do, and like big words. I do this and this transformation and that and customer experience transformation. I was like, what do you make? They're like, can you make personas? I'm like, yeah, okay, but for what? And it was a really interesting thing. So I think the interview process was like 6 months, 2 business cases, a test, met 9 people. And I think we both finally agreed, like, I don't really know what you do. And they're like, I think you have the raw ingredients to do something great here. And I'm like, I don't think you really know what you do yet because you're a new group within this thing. Let's just figure it out together. And I gave myself 6 months. I'm like, I'm going to run my company for 6 months. If this thing fizzles, fine. I still got that. And so my first impression was I couldn't understand how you structure, what's your departments? What are the service offerings? How are they different? What does it mean? I went on your website. So are you this? No, we're not that. That's the US. They do this. Okay. Like very confusing. I'm like, this is clearly designed to be this way a little bit. So then that was my first impression. And then when I got in, I was like, oh, you're a small little company inside a really big company. And there's so many small little companies inside a big place. I get it. Okay. I get it now. So we were a small company that offered these few services. But then we needed all the other companies to co-pitch with us so we could have broader set of services that we could offer our clients. And then I felt at home because I'm like, oh, I feel like I get to work at a small company again because I was worried that this big enterprise would swallow me up. But I've only worked at small to medium-sized companies and I loved it. But now I work at this massive place. But it's actually still just a small company because it's a private partnership and a series of partnerships that make this thing a whole. And so now I describe it as, hey guys, it's a shopping mall. You can come in there. It's the Dubai Mall. There's so many different shops. You don't actually work at the mall. You work at a different shop at the mall. That's it. So you can choose your shop that you want to work at. You sell different things. You work with different people, but you're all kind of under the same umbrella. So that's kind of how I describe it today. So you got to find the shop with the things that you want to sell and the place you want to work at. So that's kind of what I've come to understand it to be. And I've also come to understand that it's hard for consultancies to build silos and present themselves as individual service offerings, because that actually limits the deal size at the end of the day. When you sell an integrated offering or a series of services, your deal size is much bigger. You want to do that. A transformation isn't just like a tax project, right? It's an integrated thing between multiple lines of service that come together. So it's very interesting from the outside in. It's still more interesting from the inside looking out. So that's my answer.
My first 6 months in consulting, first 6 months, I had no idea what people were saying. I was just like, huh? What are they talking about? Occasionally I'd be in rooms with like a sales coach and they would just get up and like, can somebody just like explain to me what we just talked about?
I love that.
But most of the time, because a lot of the subject matter experts or people I would be in rooms with, I had to just learn the taxonomy, the lingo. And I think the example that you were taking earlier just reminded me of something is when we travel to a new country and let's say you learn a few phrases in their language, the moment you speak in that language and say, je m'appelle Paul or whatever, they immediately lean in and they're like, oh, this person's making an effort. And then they want to lean in and learn about your language. Yeah. That's literally what we're doing as creatives. When we go talk to, the subject matter experts in their language, we're like, yeah, but, let's say you're talking to some finance guy and you're like, okay, so if we bring in, this is the revenue, okay, what's the gross profit? What's the bottom line here? And you're talking, and they're like, wait, what? And they're like, wait, I'm interested in who this guy is. And then it's the same thing. Once you lean in and take a chance and show that you care about what they care about, then they'll want to care about you. So that goes to that first part. You're not being self-serving. You're like, I'm genuinely interested in what you do.
Yeah.
And so you're taking that. So, okay, hold on. So that's kind of what played in my brain for a second as you were describing that story. But so what are the things that you started to notice that were being done differently? So now you've joined, and first, obviously there's a haze. There's like this cloud. What the hell is going on? And you're putting the pieces together. And now when you finally start to actually do the work, what are the things that you're noticing very different from? Are they different? Are they the same from all the things that you've done in the past?
Half jokingly, I had never spent so much time in slide software before. Like it was PowerPoint, then it became Google Slides, and I didn't realize how much of everything we made would ultimately be in slides, because I had, 3 years before that, the stuff I made, everyone would see in their household, on television, at a bar, at a home, on a billboard, something on their phone, like mobile apps for Kudo and websites for commerce platforms. Like everyone could see my work that I was leading or participating in or whatever it may be. But everything we did ended up having to go into slides. That was a big whoa moment. And there was also so much pontification about things that then had to be captured and articulated in slides, a point of view, industry benchmarks. And, I was like, well, this was all very fascinating. And my questions then in my head were like, who writes this information? Where do you get this information from? How do we tailor this information so that it's actually relevant? Like, what's the so what of this, so that the reader of this content or the recipient of it will be able to be either some sort of reaction that is a favorable reaction, versus like click next slide, right? Those were the things. And then when one of the other major things that I realized is because I joined a new group, Experience Consulting. It was born like that year, or maybe half a year before that. I was like the 10th person they hired. So I was like doing 3 things. One was I was learning the whole environment of PwC. 2, I was helping build that practice because there was an strategy to execution gap. I came from a world of turning strategy work that was now brand and marketing strategy and software, because I was like format, which is one of my best experiences, into tangible outputs that people could use and feel and touch and see value from. So now I had to kind of see, how could I make these things more real beyond decks? What could we make? What prototypes could we make? How could we enact something so that people could see it and feel it and touch it? And so my role was to try to inject some of that into the practice. And the third was how to actually deliver on projects for clients using new frameworks and methods and language I'd never seen, never heard, hadn't been taught. So I just basically took these pieces of random things together and then I actually watched one group deliver a series of workshops. And at that time, because it was pre-pandemic, our work was all co-creation work, from, building like a whole transformation strategy for one of our federal clients. That was like 12 weeks, 3 days a week of co-creation, 8 hours a day. That means you had to not only know what you're working toward, meaning the playbook we were building for them, but then from that, work backwards, determine what all the inputs were that you needed for it, and then figure out how to create engaging forums to gather those inputs, remix them, build them with our SMEs and their SMEs in a journey over 12 weeks, and create the curriculum, lead and facilitate the sessions, synthesize that information, package it, and then do it again and again and again and again. It profoundly blew my brain at how it all came together and how it all comes together, because I had never seen it. you could explain it to me. It's like trying to explain academically maybe how to drive a car. It's like so many things would be thrown at you that you would need to know and things to watch and this and that. And then you'd be like, how could anyone do this? That's way too much. Just got to do it. You got to be immersed in it. And even when trying to sell that kind of work that leads to co-creation, ultimately, it's hard work to sell because they had never felt it or experienced it. The best thing was to get people who had been through it as testimonials to convince other clients that this was the way to do it. Because doing it the old way, which was like, let's go work with this functional area, then go work with this functional area, and then that one. And then we will have to reveal that these 3 functional areas don't work well together. They want this, they want that. Then we try to negotiate. And then it's like 9 months later and, we just have a deck. This is in 12 weeks. They had a transformation strategy that they executed over 3 years that helped them all the way through the pandemic because we had done it like in 2017. So phenomenal way of learning and working. Again, all the new language, new methodologies, new frameworks, all coming together. And then me being able to bring all my tools and all my experience and all my vocabulary to the table. It was bliss, quite frankly, because I was learning and then I was giving and it was creating value and other people were learning from me and I was learning from them. So it was harmonious, but it was extremely tiring work because to be in learning mode and delivery mode, is fatiguing, right?
So I think you kind of described the what of that you guys were doing a workshop and you were part of that and subject matter experts were involved. I think it'd be good to just zoom out for a second and explain why was this even happening? Why were you doing this workshop? What led to you doing the workshop in the first place? And what came out of the workshop? And why did the client invest their time and money? Because the joke is, well, we don't want a PowerPoint deck, right? At the end of it. So there was so much value created. So let's spell it out for the people listening.
We zoomed in too quick.
You don't have to take names if that's...
Yeah, I'll try. And that's what I'm filtering through my head at the moment. So the context in the story goes that, a federal agency came to us and was like, look, we need to change the way the original brief before it was reframed was, we believe we have a strategy to transform real estate, property, and I think that it would be very valuable ultimately to the citizens of Canada if we were to optimize our real estate portfolio and etc. What we realized was that means that there's a material shift in how people would have to work and behave. What you and I may take for granted, like being able to open a laptop at a coffee shop, have access to all our documents and files and materials, be able to chat in real time, be able to book meetings with people on our team across the country, across departments, across everything else, those core capabilities didn't exist. So if you want to transform how someone works, a day in the life of a federal employee, which might have been something like, I wake up in the morning, I go to the office, I badge myself in, and suddenly I'm at my desk, my cubicle with my dedicated space, and that's it. And then I go home and do my life outside of that. And I don't have access from home. I have a work device that if I'm at that level, they give me one. If I'm not at that level, I don't have one, and that's it. But if you want to move into a more fluid way of working from location to location, how do you do that? What impact does it have to the real estate portfolio? What impact does it have to the culture? What technology impact and implications does it have so that you're able to actually make sure people have this seamless experience with technology? What does it mean for policies? Work from anywhere, work from home. What does it mean for traditional managers who might have that archetype of presence is performance? So all these questions get unearthed. And if you want to have a strategy around this, you also perhaps need some way of executing on that strategy and understanding the implications. So you have to first define what a vision is. What does a day in the life of the future look like? So in order to define what a day in the life of the future is, we're not, as a consultancy, going to tell you what your future is going to be. You're going to tell us what your future is going to be, because we're going to tell you what the future already is and can be around the world at other government institutes that are way ahead of the curve. We'll use that as inspiration. But then we'll also look at totally adjacent industries and say, here's what the future looks like for them. Some industries like offer perks such as like you can bring your pets to work, but we'll also give you pet insurance as part of your package. We'll do your laundry for you. We'll have lunch and dinner and breakfast and everything there. There are all these unspoken perks that actually feed into why people show up into work. This is pre-pandemic days, right? Narrative may change today in a hybrid environment. So all these implications means that a vision needs to be set. That vision needs to come from within. That vision needs to be coming from within. It needs to come from people who influence policy, that influence real estate, that influence interior design, that actually do the work across departments. So you need representation from all the departments to participate, and at each rank, for the person who just became a full-timer to the person who's a director. So together, we take them on a journey to define the vision. And then from there, we've assessed that current state and are able to articulate it. And we say, here's how you crawl, walk, and run to your vision state. And these are all the things in the sequence that need to happen on your roadmap. And here's a prototype of what 5 core elements could be that you can touch, feel, and use today to go business case, sell, and get funding to make your transformation a reality and a success. Bring in all the right supporting functions, bring in the right supporting actors, and get this thing funded so that you're not going around with one person talking about a vision this way, one person talking about a vision that way. You're talking about the same vision. You have visuals to show it. You have a playbook. You have a plan. And you can make it a reality to realize all those business benefits that this originated from, that also creates people benefits, hiring benefits, because you actually want to work for this future version of the federal government, retention benefits, engagement benefits. There are a whole bunch of benefits. So why do we do it in a co-creation fashion? Is because if we did that in a traditional way, it would have taken 3 years to land at something, and maybe 60% of those people would have been happy and bought in. If you did it in 12 weeks with everybody at the table in a systematic way, and their fingerprints are all over it, how could they not fall in love with it and want to see it through?
I think I just orgasmed a little bit. Now tell me one iota of that resembles an agency world. 0. Because we're building it with them and not coming back to them with some solution.
True.
Because they're built it with their own hands, they can own it. They can talk, because the biggest piece is not the conversation we're having with them, but what conversations they have internally when they go away. What do they remember? What can they own? Because that's going to help them sell, right? But especially if you have the executives in the room with you, that's even better.
Absolutely.
Because the decisions are being made right then, there.
That's key. So this wasn't let's go co-create and build this whole thing and then present it to a bunch of executives to give a thumbs up or thumbs down. Oh no. There are gates along the way where their teams have briefed them, they've showed up, they're authorizing things, here are the blockers, here are the decisions, and we move it forward. So at the end of something as wonderful as that engagement structure, they have all created something and moved something forward, not just paper and pontification and everything else. This is a very pragmatic way of actually delivering value and seeing value. I will say this is also because I'm a design thinking practitioner. It's how my brain works, what I learned. I didn't even learn the words at OCAD per se, but it's just how we work. It got codified years later, etc. And it became, prevalent in a business environment and business context, whereas it was prevalent in the agency world and design world for a long time, thanks to, IDEO popularizing it. But now, as part of that, we have federal government employees who are actually design thinking practitioners. So there's a whole upskilling that happened as part of that. And they're the ones who in turn become coaches to then use the methodology to permeate through the organization to enable more change to come. So what we did with them, it's again, design thinking. We're not doing it for you. We're doing it with you, right? And that translates to them learning new skills and them doing it moreover. And this is not just limited to this one case. This is how we did it. I did it for a law firm. I did it for aviation. I've done it in a number of industries. And so that framework, that methodology has been used primarily to change the customer or the employee experience. And that's the work that my PwC career began in. And then it pivoted into designing services, creating products, which are basically another word for saying businesses, and being able to now lead a whole practice area around product management and strategic design. But that was the beginnings. All of that type of work were the early beginnings. And I learned so much from that, and I still recommend it as a career path to a lot of people who wish to become generalists at first, and get their hands dirty and learn by doing.
Firstly, definitely agree. My favorite part, and again, I've seemed like I've had the consulting Kool-Aid, but the part that I really enjoy is that you can be very, very high altitude, and then you can be boots on the ground right away.
Absolutely.
And you're kind of juggling all those different altitudes, and you can sometimes get motion sickness, but it keeps you on your feet at all times, keeps you humble. You know, the irony of all that analogy. So as you were describing, I think another piece that's really big and key here is aligning all these different minds and bodies, the change management piece of it.
It's huge.
And then I think a lot of the consulting philosophically is like, we want to come in, leave you better than where we found you, but we want to go away. We want to give all this to you so you can run with it. We want to then go solve other problems for other people, or maybe solve a different problem for you. Whereas, and I know this is getting a little bit of like agency world versus consulting. Now, in all these experiences that you've had and all the work that you've been doing and the kind of conversations you've been having, the kind of workshops you've been building, the kind of tools, products, and this is my feeling as well, is like there's literally zero similarities between an agency world and how consulting operates.
The similarities that come to mind in operation, how they operate, I mean, this is going to be very obvious. They both in service of clients. Without clients, they don't exist. Both have time and material models for revenue. And in fact, that's the baseline for most of them. And then you're right. They do have outcome based. They do have rev share. They do have other ways of being rewarded as well. I think other similarities would probably be attracting very talented people. Now they're different talents, but they're breeding ground for great talent. And I think that in each, whether you're an agency or you're in consulting, there's a growth pathway for you. And you can come in as on the creative side in an agency, you can come in as a junior writer, junior art director, or designer. And one day you can be an executive creative director, right? Whether you stay at that agency or you jump around to get there or whatever. So there is definitely growth pathways. And I think that's really important. And there is a way to make it to top. And there's a way of nurturing that talent. And they have structure in place to bring people in at a certain level to see which ones actually have it in them to progress and grow. Not all of them. It chews out a lot of people. Both are extremely hardworking environments, right? It's a labor of love to be a consultant or to be in the agency world and a creative. It's a lifestyle. It is not a job. So I think those are some of the similarities, culturally, perhaps hardworking. But I think they're just producing completely different things, and the points of intersection are few. But how they operate and there are only those that come to mind on the spot as you've asked the question. That's it. That comes to mind at this point. And again, please remember that I've also been away from the agency world since Taxi. So that's a long time.
Yeah. I think definitely. I think there's also the piece is that when in the typical agencies and what I've noticed is that, the whole thing is about, look at the awards that we won. And there's all this like, you get famous and, those awards and, the incentive is somehow, I feel, broken. I remember when I just got into this postgrad program and I went to Bombay and it was part of the chief creative officer at the time, Balky. He's like, I don't give a fuck about awards. Did the sales go up or not?
Interesting.
And so from a day one, I just like a sponge, like internalized that. And I was like, that's it. I'm not going to focus on awards. I'm not going to focus on the glamour. I'm going to focus on how can I move the needle for my client from a business perspective. And so that's where I started my career. And that's where I'm today. Always thinking about the business side of things, speaking and trying to speak, always improving and learning.
Relating to that, the first person among the first few people that helped shape that for me was a gentleman by the name of Bruce Philp. He's an author of 2 books. He was a professor of mine at OCAD. That's where I first met him. He ran a shop called GWP Brand Engineering, if I'm not mistaken, for a while. And he was the first, again, in that vintage, in that era, like business-minded person elected to the chief creative officer role. And he had a pretty magical positioning where he was able to align incentives for creatives, for awards associated with business performance. He's like, creative folk in the creative industry, and especially at that time, was all about awards. But let's focus on the awards that I think derive business value and business performance. And there are a few back then. Like I worked on one and I won one for Kudo Mobile 2 it's called the Cassies. And so, we had done something that materially saved $1 million a year by deferring calls to the call center. Like that was marketing and advertising that helped do that, because we came up with a digital platform that allowed people to go and do self-help, which is a behavior based on the consumer insight for that generation of people who were using Kudo when it was invented. So there are things that do happen in the world of advertising, that being an example, that do have business value. But you're right, they are derived from a brief, but the outcomes can actually be quite large. So Bruce was someone who introduced me to that concept. He's like, you're not going to change the culture and like pretend that awards don't exist, because if they do want to move to another company or whatever, they're going to ask about that. So how do you align those intrinsic incentives with real business value? And he was that bridge, because the books he wrote around, he helped ING in Canada. He was co-author of The Orange Code and many other things. So he's a brilliant mind among the many that, again, like I said, this whole career of mine, I've been surrounded by some seriously brilliant people that I met along the way that have really shaped how to think and how to see. Just like you shared that story, those were really moments that stood out and like really play out in a day-to-day experience.
Okay, so a couple of things. First is a contrarian view to everything that I've been, because I think that I just realized that there's like a little bit of a tone coming that, agencies suck, consulting is better. Let me just pause here for a second and say, I think, firstly, I'm very lucky that I got to work in an agency, run my own agency also, by the way, which I did for 6-7 years before moving to Canada. And I know of such transformative stories of businesses and companies around the world which have been transformed through their ad campaigns. They have really shaped the perception of not only that product or service. And, BP is a good example, especially when they had that big mess they made in the ocean with the oil. whether it comes to the idea of the designated driver, how that was slowly built into the culture. So having said that, there's a lot of great stuff and impactful things done through advertising, catchy slogans, and print ads or television spots that really shaped people's perception of certain companies and certain
and popular
ideas.
culture. Like literally popular culture and behavior, consumer behavior can be shaped by these brands. And they had historically, until Bruce positioned it in his book, saying it's become a consumer republic where it's us, the consumer, now dictating what we want and expect of the brands.
Yeah.
And that's been an interesting seismic shift.
I think the biggest piece from advertising perspective is that one is how, depending on how well the campaign ad or tactical thing or the big campaign, how they're executed, how they change perception, how they can move product from shelves, how they can get people to do certain things or get them to think about their certain actions, whether it's like a public service campaign, whatever. So the thing about advertising is that they're really good at storytelling. And I think that's kind of in shaping perception, and that's a lot of what we do. And I think what consulting does is it adds all the layers of what happens when you run a successful campaign and why you should run a successful campaign. It captures all that stuff around it. So it's like, how do we prepare the logistics and shipping so that when we run those campaigns, the phones can be on those shelves?
Absolutely agreed.
So you can't live one without the other.
I fully agree. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. So just saying, I'm not trying to shit on, I'm just saying that, as you get to that black coffee, there might be things that you're doing behind the scenes of shaping how the company is structured, where they're putting their funding, what technologies they're investing in, what people they're hiring, what products and innovation they're spending time on. And then that feeds into, okay, what's the message that we're going to put out into the world? What's the internal campaigns we're going to run?
Yeah.
But once you get into consulting, you can inform a lot of this stuff.
Agreed. Do you think that the perspective you just shared is one that if we rewind back in time and we took on the creative roles that we originally had, and we chose to only remain as pure creatives, not what we've become as mutants, and all the great how we've created all these skills and superpowers that we now possess.
Yeah.
But if we were the purest form of stayed that purest form of where we began, I don't know if a consultancy really is that attractive. If we are, as you said, individual contributors, exceptional craftspeople, whether you're an art director, copywriter, designer, whatever it may be, the best place to do creation would probably be at the best boutique, agency, or maybe even consultancy, if they actually became an agency of record for one of the premium brands that give the creative license over to that organization. That would probably be the most fertile ground for that individual as a creative. But from a business landscape perspective, which I'm interpreting this entire conversation from, I was an account guy, right? I went from an account manager to account director at Taxi. Before that, I was a producer. Before that, I was a brand designer. And so as an account guy, you're right. The types of conversations, the influence, the audiences that we speak to internally, and the sway that audience, be it the marketing director, because I'm not always getting to the CMO. Maybe this, my VPs at the agency and whatever, they were getting to that person on occasion, etc. Fine. But they don't have the same sway in the operations team and the same sway into, finance, or the same sway in any other, sub-function within the organization, technology, etc. Right? So when you're looking at a business perspective, I certainly subscribe to what you're saying. I think it really depends on the role that we're talking about. Because the creatives, I think that's why I give so much credit to creatives that come into our consultancies, because there is a sacrifice there. But there is something where they're going to have even more impact. It's just going to be a different kind of impact. It won't be awards, or maybe the awards come as an afterthought, but it's not driven primarily by that.
You made such a good point there. Also, I realize now I can't survive without the people who are dedicated to that craft.
I have to rely on exceptionally specialized craftspeople too, even if they're not creative, even if they're in operations, even if they're, engineering. I am not successful unless I can assemble the specialists and the craftspeople together.
Now that we've understood the differences between sort of, you get into a specialized studio or you get into consulting, what is it like culturally, professionally? How do you survive? How do you thrive in the environment of consulting? For other people who are listening, who want to get into consulting, who are creative, what are the things they need to start thinking about? And what are the experiences that we've had that we can share with? And that, I think that'll be a good sort of way to sort of close and leave with some great advice, experiences that we've had, learnings that we've had. At the tail end of it, I'm going to ask you, you're going to pick a number from this book,
okay,
3001 Questions About Me. And there's going to be a question at the end of that number. And then after that, we're going to have you summarize any final words and thoughts. So that's basically the structure of the remainder of the time that we have. So as a creative person who's gone from being this, let's say, independent artist, creator, which is probably the best place to start, making CDs, and that was so cool. And then getting your first client, a real estate client. And that's literally what all the Twitter bros are teaching, how to get your first real estate. You did it like freaking 20, 30 years ago. Not to date ourselves at the same time.
30's too far back.
The 2000s.
Yeah.
So there's definitely, great story there. And it's funny how the world is sort of just repeating itself where, people are trying to make their agencies and just target real estate agents. Anyways, so you've had a very interesting career. You've done work directly with clients. You worked, and then you also went to school for it. Then you worked in different agencies, played different roles, and you had some really good mentors who kind of helped and shape your thinking in terms of thinking about impacts, outcomes, and how the work that you do impacts everything else, like a ripple effect in a pond. For people listening who might be at that point where they're like, I need a change, who might want to, or be curious about what do creative people or people who execute or people who are designers, what do they actually do in consulting, and how can they get into an environment where they're sort of the outcast and fit in and not just survive, but thrive?
It's a good question. If you are a creative professional and you've typically worked in an environment that is designed for your creativity, meaning a ad agency, a design studio, or a production house, where in Toronto at least, when you walk in, it's brick and beam, or it's hyper modern or minimalist. Your environment suddenly changes to a 26-story building with a big logo on the top of it as a flagship client. Your environment also turns into something that doesn't resemble a traditional photography studio or artist studio. It's modern, of course, but there's still an element of corporate. That's what we would describe it as when you contrast it against something that is as fluid and organic and thoughtful as a creative studio, and imperfect sometimes because these are heritage buildings. Typically. So first, your environment's going to look different. But the second thing is that the people are going to look different too. Depending on the different groups, like within consulting, you have, digital operations, you have pure play management and strategy consulting, you have experience consulting, you have tech strategy as consulting. The different groups, and you can consider all of them to have different subcultures. They will look different. Some actually in the financial services sector will wear suits because their clients wear suits. So they kind of are a mirror image of what their clients do. So they'll wear suits to the office. But one floor down, you'll see, my team, for example, and we're not wearing suits. Or if we are wearing suits for some reason, we're wearing them as sneakers, and it's probably something that's super fashionable because someone's got a really interesting sartorial taste and they're expressing themselves. But that's like the minority. So the people will look different. Now they're going to sound different because they're going to be all speaking different languages. They're going to care if they're from the financial sector. They'll know the financial services lingo. They'll know all the banks. They'll know all the sub functions within it. The different engagement styles. Engagements are another word for projects. They'll have different approaches. What you'll also find is that many sub functions or many subgroups within consulting will say the same thing completely differently. They'll all mean the same thing, but someone will say it's this, and the other group will be like, no, it's this. And then it'll be you who will be like, you're saying the same thing, which is this. and that's simply, again, because of these subcultures that exist. And so it'll look different, it'll sound different, and it'll feel different because you're going to be the most creative, visibly creative person there. Now, the one thing that's going to feel very familiar in an instant bonding moment between you as a creative and a traditional consultant is you are both extremely good at problem solving. That is where you will find common ground instantly. And if you start to talk about the way you approach problems and the types of problems you solve, in fact, if we gave you both the same problem statement and how you would come up with your solutions, it would be really interesting just as an icebreaker. What materials would the consultant use and the ideas they would come with, and what vantage point would they look at it, and what would they manifest as the final deliverable? What would the creative professional come up with, depending on their craft and medium and everything else and specialization? But that's where you can find common ground. And to your point, Paul, another thing for success in that environment would be to take an interest in it. So what is that person's role? What is their job? And if they can't explain it or it sounds too vague, ask them to walk them through an example of the last project they worked on. Because sometimes when you try to summarize the accumulation of a variety of things you do, it's very hard. Talk about the last thing you did and ask them about the different roles and the different people that contributed to it. And then try to relate to something like that. And in the way you might relate to it is like, hey, we did this, we produced this thing. And in it, we had contributors from, I don't know, from different vendors, different SMEs, different specialists in creative. And together we made this thing. So actually, there's a lot of parallel about how we approached it. Oh, you assessed to see, as a consultant, what the competitors were doing, et cetera. We actually did the same thing too, but the lens we were looking at it through is like maybe popular culture and, how people are reacting to things and, the social verse, etc. So there is a lot of common ground if you start around the problem space and everything else. But don't be threatened because people use jargon and lingo and language that you don't understand. In fact, they're probably going to be threatened when you start talking about, user experience research and you talk about contextual inquiry and ethnographic this and that and, prototyping and concept testing. And, they're going to think of it as rather foreign, but I think it's both people's responsibilities. But being the minority and bringing back to identity, if you're the minority in something, you might just have to try a little bit harder to help bridge the gap. And so that would be my advice. I think it isn't a scary place to be if you take some of these practical points into account. And when you're in a big place, you always have a global community of creatives. So immediately jump on to the global chat groups, meet with the global, your global peers from other territories in the US, UK, Australia, wherever else. Find out what's happening on the ground. Figure out how many people they have in their team, what they have produced, look at their portfolios. So I think there's a lot of ways to start to find your footing and kind of create a sense of community or actively participate in community. Those are some of the things that come to mind. And I'm sure if anyone from PwC is going to be listening or watching this, they're probably like, Yousuf is over-indexing on the creative people and he's not talked about product management whatsoever. And all the product managers, which is the majority of my team, are going to be like, what's this guy doing? But that's what I would say on the creative side, because every business needs creativity. And the advice I would give to the consultants that are listening to this, you make the effort to understand what they do and how they can deliver value. You're going to sell more You're going to be able to articulate your visions better. And ultimately, you're going to have a thought partner that you never had that will be able to unlock things and help you see things that you've never seen from that vantage point before, that will give you a competitive advantage and help you grow. Ultimately, in the advertising and design world, there was always like the art director, copywriter pairing. I think if you can put a designer with a consultant, especially a designer that understands research and can actually create and produce, can do some service design as well, you've got a really killer combo there.
That was really, really articulate and really well. I think you captured a lot of good ground there. I have one question for you, which I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to also share one thing that I took away from what you were saying. So that'll give you some time to think about that answer. Is because you and I have had sort of a similar, like I said before, similar journey. My personal perspective is that this is like a really good natural way to get into consulting. Is you start off by doing the thing that you love doing. And if you continue doing that, you can maybe one day just be an individual contributor, or you might want to just stay on the studio side. So if you're naturally a motion designer, or you're an art director, or you're a copywriter, and if that's all you care about, then just stay there.
That's where
amazing.
You'll do the best work of your career in that moment in time. You should be your guiding force. In my opinion, if as a creative professional, if you are driven by making, go where you feel fulfilled making.
Exactly. And so this is going to pair perfectly with the question is, why should you not get into consulting? While you think about that, one thing that I found in my personal experience that worked really well in helping survive and thrive in that consulting environment is I would just dress the way I'm dressed now. And because most of, like you described earlier, most of the consulting firms are typically corporate, although I have seen a lot of change where a lot of people will dress.
Absolutely.
And I think the difference in the nuance is people who are client facing and versus who are not client facing.
Great point.
The day you have a meeting, especially if you're a banker, you're going to be expected to dress in a certain way, and that's totally fine. But one thing I noticed was that when you're sort of like this dressed down and you not playing dumb, but you're just kind of curious and you have like that child's mind, people open up to you way more. And you're just like, oh, wait, how does that work? Oh, how did you do that? Oh, that's really cool. And you'll find that people open up and you'll start building connections. And because they're not going to feel threatened by you, because these environments are very, very competitive. Unlike agencies, I don't know how typically, haven't had very, very long experiences with an agency in a long time, but consulting is very competitive. And so to do that, if you are like, I don't want to say the clown, but if you're sort of, if you're exception to the rule kind of thing, that actually plays in your favor.
Yeah. Standing out actually works in your favor. Yeah.
Especially in consulting. And that's been my personal experience. So I'm just like, huh? How do you do this? Oh, and it's almost like you kind of go in and you set this tone of, oh, we need to explain this to Paul. Because remember we were talking about earlier, everybody in the room's like, what the fuck are they talking about? But if you have somebody like me and like, guys, I have no idea what I'm saying, I can just raise my hand and they're like, oh no, Paul's not a consultant. We need to explain it to him in simple words. And there you go. You have magic. So that's actually strategically worked really well for me to go and be that guy. Oh, hi guys, I'm not the consultant. I have no idea what you guys are talking about. Can you explain it to me in simple word? And it's very easy to sort of play that card.
That's insightful. It's interesting that you go in, dress authentically the way that you choose to. Before joining PwC, after accepting their offer, I ended up basically buying a new wardrobe. Yeah. I knew I needed to kind of look the part, but what I needed to do was also do it in my authentic way. So I didn't just go and get like matchy suits and this and that and whatever else. I went and kind of did it with my flair and my own style and everything else. And yeah, so, picture winter of 2017, nobody in that office is wearing a turtleneck and a blazer. I'm the guy. I'm the guy rocking that before it became like whatever, the usual, everyone's wearing it in winter kind of situation. Then they're like, who's that guy?
Trendsetter.
At the consultancy. Okay, let's relax. It's not that great. But I then used it as a vehicle, just like you, clothing as a vehicle, a point of differentiation, leaning into the fact that I am slightly different. And that is also something I give credit to a place like PwC for, is like, you can show up and be different.
My internal philosophy is you don't need to look serious, be serious to do serious work.
That's actually true. You're absolutely right. I mean, think about, I don't know, extremely high-ranking military professionals. That's very serious work. But a lot of military professionals actually have a really good sense of humor, because you're actually going to need some of that to balance out the serious work that you're doing, right? I'm sure in the medical industry, it's the same. Can't always be,
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, I'm sure the surgeons and doctors and nurses have a very dark sense of humor.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sure. But I've been very lucky that all the people that I've worked with, we used to just laugh so much. We would just be laughing, giggling, and getting through like really difficult, stressful situations by just laughing through them. And so I was very, very lucky to all the people that I've worked with. Okay, so coming back to that question now, do you feel, or would you have a recommendation at what stage, if a creative person wanted to get into, or what would be the drawbacks or the pros and cons of getting in early versus coming in a little bit later when you're a little bit more mature? Because I feel like early on, you just want to get stuff done and consulting might be too slow. But later on in your life, I feel that it's the size of impact that you're making that matters more, maybe. Again, I don't know what your thoughts are.
I think that it would be up to the person to assess through, their network or through informal interviews or whatever, to assess the maturity of the design group within that consultancy, because each one will have a different level of maturity. Like, I'm sure Accenture and Deloitte, being as large as they are and heavily invested, we'll have a very large, design community and culture, and maybe really good growth pathways so that you can start on a variety of things that are tangible, tactical, and can grow. But if you're in a place that's less mature, it means that you're probably not going to work on a ton of things. You're going to work on few very important things. And I think as a creative professional, you're probably in the early days caring about your portfolio and the type of work you're doing. The more interesting projects that you can sink your teeth into, the better, right? So based on my experience, now I haven't gone and assessed all the consultancies and walked the halls of all of them, but I would say that there is value in starting and building a portfolio outside of consulting before you come into consulting, so that you can show consulting different ways of doing things and thinking when you have different types of constraints, and then have the maturity to discuss those constraints and recognize that there will be different kinds of constraints when doing creative work in a consultancy. And then say, if I could do this over there with those constraints, imagine what I could do over here with you, for you, right? Like that. I think that maturity and that portfolio and that sort of a little bit more runway with clients, and being able to advocate for your own work, defend your creative work as needed, challenge, receive criticism on the work, and not, mix your identity into it. You need a little bit of thick skin and a little bit of experience to really enjoy and have a bigger impact in consult, and then grow up there. Because you want to know how to push your own career forward in an environment that wasn't designed only for your creative career. It's designed primarily for specialists like in tax, assurance, consulting, deals, to go up the associate, senior associate manager, senior manager, director, partner, salary partner, equity partner route, right? So you now have to have that maturity to understand how you're going to marry your craft and grow in your craft while also rising up in rank. And that's That's a lot if you're just starting out. If you just want to start on the craft, start elsewhere, and then choose to go in there, like within 4 years, you know? What would you say to that?
I think that's a fair assessment, because a lot of the consulting is a lot of understanding. Because in an agency, if you're like a really good art director, really good copywriter, you don't have to interact too much with people. You can go into a room and like, okay, what's the brief? Okay, what's the challenge? Okay, I'm going to write some sick ass copy. You can go at it. Whereas, as we discussed earlier, firstly, we drew the difference and what are the things that are different and common about how an agency and a studio might work and how consulting works. In consulting, you're really working with the client at like a very minute and different altitudes with them, and really shaping, okay, what are we trying to build here? Because you're working with them. Firstly, at a high level, how these big bodies work with clients, and then within that, how the different service lines or the different verticals, and then the different pods, and then how the different teams, how individuals. So if you really look at all of that in the context of how they work with the client and what role they're playing, on the agency side of things, I've felt that you could have an antisocial creative director, and that could still work. Because the guy's amazing. He makes like the most amazing things, but he doesn't talk to anybody. That can totally work. Whereas, and he just talks once in a while to the account director when he feels like it, right? And then on the consulting side, that's not going to fly at all,
No.
right? So the reason I'm saying that is that, and again, I'm not trying to like, this is not trying to show off, but just from day one, the learning that was taught to me is focus on the sales, not on the awards. I've always had a very consultative approach to the work. And so I've never had to defend my design or sell my design, because I've been working with the client at every step of the way. The kind of questions I'm asking, they're like, this guy cares about my business more than I do. He knows more about my business than I do. It's nice of them to say that, but I'll never know about their business better than they do. It's nice sometimes when they say that, but yeah, it's like what we talked about earlier, knowing their industry, knowing their space, who are the competitors, who's out of that category, not the immediate competition. And we're not even talking about visual design or logos or copy. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, okay, where do you source this product? How much does it cost to source a product? Have you tried this country? What about those companies? They get it from there. And now when you're coming from there, the person that you're creating for, they're going to be like, this person already has my best interest. So if they've made something, it's probably right. And they never try to question it. In my career, it's very rare that happens that when I present something, they're like, oh, we don't like this. They're like, this is exactly what we were looking for. That's 99% of the times the answer. And again, I'm trying to show off. And then the 1% of the times they're like, oh, this is totally off the mark. I'd be like, what is it about this? And this is like a common question. I'll be like, you know what? If it's off the mark and if you're feeling that, you're probably right. I have a million ideas. Give me some time. I'll just make something new. I'm not even going to try and say, let's squeeze and jam this down like a wedge. So even when that does happen, I'm like, I come from the philosophy, abundant mind. I have a million ideas. I can say this in a million different ways. Don't worry about it. I'll be like, this is easy to change. Let's just scrap it. Because I'm not going in to sell the idea. I'm in the best interest of what we're trying to do. So if it is not working, let's just do something else. Who cares? Of course, in an agency, they're like, oh, we're gonna have to go back and rebudget this. The whole mindset is different. So that's why I never think about defending the work or defending the role of design. Because as a designer, those are the kind of conversations, the resolution of questions you're asking, and you're really embedded with that client, and you really are stepping into their shoes. Because a lot of people say, like, I've heard creative people say this all the time, designers, oh, I like to have business conversation. Like, okay, what kind of business conversation? Tell me. And it's so like, that's not a business conversation. No, I really like speak to okay, what do you know about the business? And they can't give me like 3 examples. Okay, what do you know about their business? How do they manufacture the product? Do you know their financial statements? Have you read the annual report even once? Okay, have you seen interviews of the CEO? So what business conversation are you having?
Where do you think, Paul, we fall short as leaders, maybe in the education system for creative professionals, that may be able to coach people to take on that as a potential uh, persona, as they sort of figure out what type of and what kind of creative professional they'd like to become? Where do you think is the right place along that journey of, I've identified as becoming a creative professional, I'm going to get educated at school for it, I'm going to go practice it for the first time in the real world? Some of this, you know, was self-taught, right? Like the way you taught yourself, you had these kind of sparks and moments along the journey. But part of this has to be that we also help have those conversations with people, help them see it, give them the vocabulary, much like I needed help being in that environment and consulting, to be told and shown and listen to that vocabulary, to pick it up. Just even in the early days, watching Jules, in the boardroom, or watching Carl with clients, that helped me. But we need to create an environment for our creative professionals to do that if we believe that is truly a differentiating factor. How do you think we could go about doing that for this next generation of creatives?
Firstly, I would say it's not for everyone, and everyone shouldn't do it, actually. The reason you and I are having this conversation is because you're also a generalist, and you kind of are interested in so many different things, and you bring all these different things together. I'm just going to let the cop car go by. So, there's people who are the bridge builders. That's what we are. And we know that, okay, we're allocators, not capital allocators. We're skill allocators. Okay. And depending on the problem at hand, okay, this is the problem at hand. First, having that skill set of being able to ask the right questions, being curious, and figuring out what is the actual problem. And versus what's the self-diagnosis, what's the actual symptom, because they'll be talking about the symptom, but they're not necessarily the cause of it. So instead of putting a Band-Aid on it, which typically advertising agencies do, and which sometimes works, but it's like, okay, wait a second, you have a fever. Okay, where were you for the last couple of days? Just like a doctor would. Anyways, and they'll ask your family history and blah, blah, blah. So first is the curiosity part, and not jumping to conclusions and solution-oriented and jumping to, okay, let's make this really cool idea. And when you go down that path, you're building confidence, trust, and I've been heard. Mm-hmm. Till the time you don't get that, you are always, if you don't start off with that foot, you're going to encounter the problems of having to defend your work, having to defend what you do. Because they're like, this guy doesn't even know what my problem is. Because the client doesn't even know what their problem is. You have to be able to identify their problem better than they can. That's the first skill. And it's not for everyone. I would only recommend to people who want to be generalists.
Okay.
And because a lot of the individual contributors will look at the world based on what they can do. Wait, how does this relate to digital? Wait, how does this relate to graphic design? They're just going to think from that lens. So only a generalist who agnostic to everything and is not a niche can put all those pieces together. So you have to sacrifice not specializing in one thing.
Yeah. And that's hard. In fact, that was a very hard lesson. I remember my second job at the Hive, the CEO sat me down and we had a one-on-one, and he's like, you're good at many things, but you're going to have to choose one. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I don't want to choose one. And in that moment, I was like, I'm never going to choose one of the things that was an option for me at that agency and just only be that. But it was a good provocation at that time. And it sat in my head for a long time as a narrative that I had to choose a lane. That's why I kept jumping around from lane to lane, because I'm like, I want to learn this, I want to learn that. And then until recently, I'm allowed and I'm valued for being a generalist. So you're right. Maybe this advice isn't for all people who wish to be a creative professional, but for those who wish to be a generalist and maybe a leader of teams, because that's the context in which you're going to be faced with being client facing and also selling work, delivering on work, and motivating teams to do it too.
Correct. So you're not moving pixels around, you're moving people and ideas and aligning people and bringing them on the same page and getting that. So the other thing that's really critical here is, so it really begins with how you show up. And even when I started with this consulting role, first I didn't even understand for 6 months. What are they talking about? I was like, just give myself time. Like, even though I don't understand a single word of what they're talking about, I'm going to give myself time. But initially they were like, yeah, just go make this placemat.
Yeah.
And I joined as a senior designer, and I just needed a job, and I was like, I need to have a job, and whatever they'll give me, I'll just take it.
Yeah.
And so I took that. But initially for 6 months, because firstly I didn't know what they were talking about, so I was just like, I'll just take orders.
Yeah.
Go do this, I'll go do that. But with time, I would be in the room and I would just ask a question. And then that became 2 questions and 3. And then I would reach a point where I would just lead the room just asking stupid questions. The point here is as the quality of my questions over time improved, the more they were like, okay, you just lead this. You guide the conversation and get the info. And
Get
I
the
always
inputs. Yeah.
Yeah, and I always go in with, I don't have the solution. I don't have the idea. You already have the idea in your head. My role is just to get it out of you and give it shape and manifest it. Yeah, versus saying this is my idea and I need to defend my idea. So I think that's the reason why I totally against the idea of defending the idea or defending the role, because it's not my idea. It is their idea. They just don't have the skill set to bring it to life. A lot of the role of designer is just like what we are intuitively doing, breaking it down analytically so that other people around you feel comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, is there like a process to this?
Yes. That's so well said, Paul. Like, I agree with you. Absolutely agreed with you, because half of this is being able to find your words to articulate your intrinsic natural way of being, so that it's for the benefit of others, for their comfort. And sometimes what may happen is that when you put something down on paper, like, you could look at the double diamond framework from, design thinking, for example. That's one flavor of it. If you look at the double diamond framework, those who academically understand it but are not designers will say, okay, so if we go through this process, checklist, we'll come to the solution at the end, and then we're done, right? Okay, so it's you need 4 weeks in discover, define, and 4 weeks in ideate and prototype, and then at the end of 8 weeks, we're done, right? It's like you will have something at the end of 8 weeks, no doubt. And but what you will find is that during discovery, we might actually reframe your problem statement because of because of the discovery activities. This might be the wrong one. Then when we go through definition, we're going to reframe it yet again and then narrow it down into the area that we wish to actually problem solve in. And then when we come to ideation, that we may come up with an array of things. But by testing those, the most salient idea in prototyping is when we will know if that actually resonates with the people we're making this with and for, because they've been part of that journey. Is it resonating or not? Because some people, they're still human beings that aren't creative, who aren't creative professionals rather. Everyone's creative, and that's not a creative professional, that needs to see something before they can understand it and believe it. And Steve Jobs said that too. You got to show them. And so sometimes you do have to put in that extra effort to like make it medium fidelity, maybe even high fidelity. And yes, I know designers are probably rolling their eyes like it's such a waste. But seeing is believing. And just because you can see it in your eye, in your mind's eye, and you can see it all the way through the whole journey, this person is probably thinking, maybe it's a bicycle. And you're like, I just described a fucking rocket ship to you. What are you thinking of a bicycle? So you have to show them the rocket ship.
Yeah.
So I think there's an education around this, and I think it's unfortunately the designer's responsibility at this point in time in this point in the maturity of the design world within consultancies, yes, I believe that creative professionals will have to do a little bit more work around educating about their craft and building those bridges. And I also believe that they have to make that extra effort to learn about what's on the other side of the bridge to make sure that those dots are connected.
Very well put. I think one example that you brought up earlier in the conversation and just now is just putting something in front of people and not worrying about it like hurting your feelings if people get feedback to it, because you're going with the intention that when you put something in front of people, they can react to it and you can quickly suss out and get a sentiment of the room. And I love doing that. Just like quickly, I'm not too worried about what it looks like. I'm just like, guys, let's just have a quick look. Is this kind of what we're thinking? And I'm not married to like, this is, oh yeah. Okay. Let's just, if I'm feeling that there's some, and when people start defending it amongst themselves, then I just take a pause and I sit back and I just enjoy the conversation. I just let them sell it to themselves. And that's like kind of knowing that when to shut up and when to talk. But anyways, I love that idea of like quickly putting something in front of people so they can react to it. And then you just sit back and see what happens. And you use that as a way to find out, because if there's merit in the idea, they're going to sell it amongst themselves.
And that's where the art of facilitation comes in. You've given something for them to respond to. You've given them time to discuss by listening and you've stayed quiet. But then you start to help facilitate that to arrive at something that is an evolution of what you presented, right? Which inputs from them and maybe some of your own creative ingenuity at that point that packages or links it together. That's the art of facilitation as well, right? It's that delicate balance. You're not giving them the answer, but you're teasing the answer out in balance with putting your own influence on it as well.
I love that. I think I find that to be way more satisfying and fruitful than saying in an agency, look at this cool idea I came up with. Versus here, I'm like, is this what you guys were thinking? Is this helping, bring into the real world what we've been talking about? And then they're like, yeah, this is what we were thinking about. And to really see people light up when it's like, yeah, this is what we were thinking. And it's finally coming, that I think is a little bit more satisfying. And then there is no reason to defend your idea because it's not your idea. It's the group's idea.
Yeah. I think though, from my historic experience in the agency world is that, and this is not meant to be controversial, but I don't think if there was some sort of statistical analysis done that clients have had better ideas than creative professionals who get paid and are trained to come up with those ideas. Maybe very few times has the client been that provided the transformative idea, right? So it's just that giving room, depending on the craft. If you're building a product, if you're building an app, if you're building a web app, if you're building a platform, you can't do it willy-nilly with a magic wand in a vacuum, because you're not making it for yourself. You're making it to unlock the millions of dollars or whatever the metric is that you're trying to unlock, saving time, making money, deferring costs for the hundreds, if not thousands, and maybe even millions of people who are meant to use the thing. So you best be designing with them and for them together rather than away. But when you're coming up with a creative concept, like a creative platform for like a brand campaign with like positioning, part of me would actually trust the doctor more than I would trust the patient in that setting. But I would trust the patient to tell me if they're going, after they've, taken the pill or whatever it is, what analogy we want to use, what they're feeling, what the symptoms are, whatever. And if those symptoms are phantom symptoms or if those are real symptoms that they're feeling, euphoria or pain, right? And wasn't it in the book Build? It's like, don't make products or software that are vitamins. Make painkillers, right? Isn't that what the author said? He said it far more eloquently and succinctly and poignantly. Like it was so well put. But just painkillers is what you're looking for, not not vitamins. Vitamins are optional.
That's actually a really good example. I really like what you said, is because if the clients could come up with ideas, why would we need creative people? I think the nuance here is, and I think this is where like the conversation getting like really deep, and we're about to.
I know we're ending, but yeah.
But this is where it's getting like really juicy. But first, if you look at like a really good surgeon, they're gonna, or like a really good, let's not use the word consultant, but let's say thought partner, one of the words that you use, or thinking partner or whatever, or the surgeon. What they're going to do is when the patient comes in, and of course, this is not in all cases because there's a whole problem with how the incentive structure and the time of doctors is allocated in their contract. And
this is conceptual theory that we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just put that aside for a second. But, because they have to we can only spend like 15 minutes with per patient, blah, blah, blah. This is what happens when you get outside of thinking graphic design. Is you start to understand what's the real problem that surgeon is facing. How come he's not giving you all that attention? Because his incentive is not designed. Anyways, so just went off on a tangent. So the point is that they're going to be like, okay, what's the pain you're feeling? Okay. And then you're going to tell them, oh, but I did this and I did that. They're like, okay. And they're going to like, okay, wait, does your dad also have this problem? Grandparents? Okay. And then what did you do that day? What was different this time? And as you're describing that story, they're going to sniff out the bullshit. They're going to read between the lines. They're going to read the subtext of the conversation. And then they're going to find, oh, wait, I'll give this person the medicine that they need because there's some element of placebo that they need, that this is going to solve my problem, but they also need to change their lifestyle, which is leading up to this problem. So there's a whole gamut of stuff that's happening. So for a creative person in that same context, depending on if you're going down that generalist path, the client is describing their problem, you could just really be like, wait, after all this conversation, you're like, I think all this is about is just ego, because that guy's wife, friend, they started that real estate company and they just put up this huge structure and they just want to basically one leg up them. And this whole exercise is just that. Okay, let's give them that. And it's not about selling the apartments because they just told you they've already sold all the apartments. I actually worked on a real estate project in which they're like, so we've already sold all the apartments and we want to do a campaign. I'm like,
for what?
And I couldn't figure it out. And I was like, okay. I was like, let's just meet for drinks. We'll just chat, ask more dumb questions. And you're like, oh, this is what's going on. And then when we came up with the campaign, it was targeted at like snob value. And he's like, this is exactly what I wanted. Without creative people, you're absolutely bang on. Business people they can only describe the symptom. And sometimes they're not even going to describe the symptom properly. So it's the role of the surgeon or the generalist or
that team.
So to the point is the person asking the questions. What I mean by questions is you're reading everything. What's that person's emotional state? Where are they coming from? What's really driving them? Is it that they want to get promoted? What's really happening here? What they're not even telling you. And that's why the role is to get to that truth from where everything is originating. And then when you come up with ideas and solutions, they'll always be on point because you've taken that time up front. And I feel creative people don't do that enough. So that's, I think, spending more time being curious, being dumb, not having to look cool. Be like, oh, I don't know how this works. Oh, okay. It's not the Don. I'm totally I found the Don Draper and all that really cool. I love it, but that's not the approach that I've had working on anything. They're like, get out of the room.
Yeah.
It's like, that looks cool on screen, but that's not my experience in the last 15 years. Anyways, so that's a long-winded way of saying that I totally agree with you. The creative person or the thought partner, thought partner is much better, is going to actually figure out first, what is the actual problem? Why? And then come back with, okay, this is what we actually need to do. Whether that's actually that we need to totally digitally transform to be with competition, or it's because, this is like a signaling thing, or this is a brand thing, or whatever that is. Would I say that you're not coming up with ideas? You're the bridge builder of helping them first identify, okay, this is the actual problem. You're helping them define that problem. And you're like, oh, fuck, it's like therapy. And then it's like, okay, to get to solve this problem, these are the things we're going to do. And then when you start coming with ideas, they're like, oh, I see now how this vision in their mind, that the dots start to connect. And so you can't do it without the creative people or the thought partner. And then at no point they're like, no, this is not what we want. Because you've already, before beginning the work, already set the tone of what's to come.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of my approach. But
yeah,
and I've learned it through other people who I constantly give shout outs to. But that's kind of the thinking. So that's just my 2 cents. Sorry, I'm also kind of like thinking through the experience, but also trying to describe it, and it gets a little bit choppy. Anyways, so we've covered a whole bunch of ground. Let's start to close this.
Let's do it.
Now, before I actually do this, I have one final question for you. So what kind of stuff are you involved in these days? What kind of work are you doing? And what are the things that you're really passionate about these days?
Okay, so what am I involved in these days? So I've just taken over as this new head of product management and strategic design.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's definitely a privilege, but it's a ton of fun too, because the team's really smart. And I'm just very lucky to have earned that trust pretty quickly. So what are we involved with these days? So PwC, like other consultancies, are continually going through their own types of transformation. And as part of that transformation, it should be no surprise that there's always a desire to find new revenue. How might we find new revenue, right? And then you might end up, selling more of the same work, or selling more of the same work differently. But what role can software play in all of that? How does software help us actually deliver work faster? How does software help us deliver it more effectively and therefore become more profitable? How do we have new passive sources of revenue that add value into our client streams? How do we bring people into the funnel of being clients through software streams? And so that means basically assessing new business models. And so I work with a really, really good team in the products and technology group that help to assess market opportunity, that help to assess what problems are trying to be solved across the whole organization, and what role software can play, whether that's software that exists, software that we have in other parts of PwC around the world, or software that we have to invent, and it's our own intellectual property. And my team's heavily involved with our own intellectual property, and either inventing or nurturing and growing those software experiences so that our clients can use them in the market, so that our practitioners can use them within the organization. And then when you realize that PwC is also a 100-plus-year-old service-based organization, you realize that software is going to play a supporting role in that, and then sometimes it's going to play a lead role in that too. And so making sure that our software experiences are designed to account for the whole client journey, because you want to present yourself as one organization and one firm with many services, whether or not you're a siloed mix mash of things behind the scenes, and whatever your operating model is behind the scenes shouldn't be the problem or burden of the client and the end user, the ultimate thing. So that's what the strategic design team is there for, is to look at the end-to-end client journeys and the experiences, create service blueprints, and then to make sure that software and technology is enabling those target experiences and making sure that we either buy, build, procure, and or import software and basically create that desirable experience for clients and for people. And that's a pretty big mission to go on, to unlock new revenue and to basically win in the market.
Fuck, that's so cool.
It's a really interesting mission, and it's actually one of the big motivators right now is that it's a big hairy problem, in a big hairy opportunity. It's not a problem; it's an opportunity, and I'm a little scared. And anytime that I'm a little scared, I know that I'm growing. I know that feeling. I know the feeling because when I walked into taxi and before I had my interview, I was like, fuck, I think I'm going to get this job. And I hadn't met anyone yet. And I went into the interview and I just had that feeling. And then I was scared because I'm like, how am I going to do this job? I was a producer, and then before that I was a designer. How am I going to do this account job? And then same thing with PwC. When those interviews kept going and I did these tests and business cases and everything else with them and presented, I was like, shit, I think they're going to hire me. And then the offer came, like, okay, this is cool, got it. And then I'm like, what am I going to wear? And then I'm like, what am I going to do? I don't even know what they do. How am I going to do this? But I figured it all out because I had good people around me that helped me along the way. And similarly right now, I just feel really grateful for this mission. I'm firing in all cylinders as that generalist. I got my design and my creative team going. I got my business side firing in all cylinders. I got my client service and client experience side going. I got my sales side going. I got my leadership side and people leadership and coaching going. And I'm receiving great leadership coaching as well. So like, I feel in this moment in time, in this podcast, in this interview, it's definitely a state of flow and zen. Yeah.
You know, this is a reason to bring you back where we want to talk more about some of the transformative work that's ongoing. And I know you use the word software quite a bit. Do you mean AI a little bit, or you don't want to steer clear of the word AI?
It's just I love that LinkedIn post. It's like day one summary of the conference collision. AI, and break. AI. No. I'll let everybody else talk about generative AI and let one of your other your hosts talk ad nauseum about that. Yeah.
Fuck, that's so funny.
It's transformative. It's here. Wonderful. Like, I'm going to use it. We're going to use it. We're going to figure out our relationship with it. We're going to find the use cases for it. And it's here. It's here. That's it. Like, good. It's good. Yeah. It's here.
I think there's one piece that you described was not only learn this new reality, but also then service clients and deliver that new reality. So there's like this almost like, what's that analogy they use in consulting? We're building the plane as we're flying it.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered a lot of bases. And what I want to do now is ask you the 3001 questions all about me. You're going to pick a number between 1 and 3001.
Okay.
And I know this is a little bit of an abrupt sort of segue into this topic.
96.
96? Okay. And then after you, let's go to the question first. 96. I was at Indigo and I spotted this book. I was like, this is perfect for the pod.
It's a great book and it's a great idea.
91. Okay. Ooh, okay. Here we go. This is like such a consultant question. You're so lucky. Who are my biggest allies?
Oof. I think maybe if you asked me that question a few years ago, I think my answer would be different. And the material difference between then and now is that I realized that a career in this environment of consulting is a team sport. And that team sport isn't actually the team at work, it's the team at home. Because at the very beginning of this conversation, we said that the similarity between advertising and consulting is that those are not jobs, those are lifestyles. And so I think one of my biggest allies among the many that I do have that support me is definitely my wife and my 1-year-old son, who gives me the grace of being away when I need to be away, but also shows me love as soon as I'm home. And, we pick up from where we leave off. And quite frankly, for my wife, who's encouraged me to take on more and more in terms of bigger mandates, it was a choice for me to take on this head role. It was an option. I could have declined it, but I also wanted to grow. But I also knew that it means more time, more commitment, juggling priorities for a period of time as we, reform this team and everything else. So I think one of my biggest allies is definitely at home and the home base. So Syra and my son Zayden. I think my parents, to go back to the origin story of talking about crazy risk takers, and when I make decisions that may be contrary to what they would do, They have actually chose to listen, to understand, and then support, because so far I haven't fucked up too badly. And so they're willing to support me. And I think, I have the good grace of having, an ex-brother-in-law and a current brother-in-law, both of which that have played instrumental roles. And then on the professional environment, my allies, key partners that I have at the firm that have helped enable me in my growth. I joined as a senior associate. I mean, like I really worked my way up, and they've given me the space and opportunity to do it. But I've also had to go hunt for that and create that opportunity myself too, right? I just needed the sponsorship. So I think that's how I'd answer that question. Today, I would start with home, because it's hard work to do what I do, but then have to still show up to be a husband, to be a son, to be a dad, and to play the many other roles in my community and everything else that I do. So yeah, that's probably how I'd answer that. How were you expecting me to answer it? And
No, I think that's spot on. I think I'm going to say something very consulting. You married the IQ with the EQ so well, tied it, put a bow on it. That was fantastic. And so I would love for you to summarize and any thoughts that you would want to leave the audience with. And it doesn't have to be something that we spoke about specifically. So while you think about that, I'm going to just do a little summary of my own. So I feel that the first conversation that we had today was a great way to sort of open up the aperture of sort of creative design, career paths, also how they might differ, if you go into advertising and if people are interested in consulting. So I think it's a great way to sort of open up this discussion, but it also means it's a great way or the perfect stepping stone to have the next conversation. And when we watch this podcast back, I'll watch it in editing in great detail, we'll know what are some of the gaps, what are some of the big holes and areas or interesting things that we talked about that we can go further deeper into, and hopefully have you back. And this was not a torturous experience for you, and you're like, oh dude, I should totally. And so that's that. So would love to have you back and go deeper into some subjects. And also, you'll notice that people, when they watch it and whatever version of or whatever length they watch, they'll come back and they ask you questions. You're like, wait, we could actually talk about that in the consecutive episode. So I'm just setting the next steps before we even end this.
Such a consultant. And here the next step slide.
Literally, that's just translating it for the audience here. Setting the next step even before you leave the room. And so you're leaving on a high note and you're like, I'm already committed to the next episode. Shit.
I honestly, this has been such a privilege, and I really appreciate you inviting me here into your studio and for us to have this conversation. I really enjoyed it. And honestly, even without these microphones, I think we'd have great conversation, and we should definitely do this with or without the microphones. Happily come back to double click on something that's of interest to you and your audience. Please let me know, and I'll definitely be back. But to answer your question, or rather your provocation around any sort of closing thoughts, I think more recently, two thematics have come have emerged for me. One is around. Just wait for the streetcar. So the two thematics that have emerged for me recently that I think I'd like to share in conclusion. First is around, if you're innately a creative person, but have the gift or curse of being able to do many things beyond that or apply that creativity in many settings, I think it's important not to get lost into the culture of the environment that you have entered into and seem to be succeeding in. Because the culture of a place, as they say, eats strategy for breakfast, but it can also erode temporarily your values and your strengths. If you are just like a muscle, if you're a creative person and you're overusing that muscle, you're going to sprain it and strain it and injure it. And then you keep doing that without giving it rest, you're going to end up maybe even not being able to do that thing anymore and having to do something else. So I think nurture your creativity, manage your energy, create boundaries and maintain those boundaries between work and home and life. Because, creativity comes from a very sacred source, and there's only so much of it available, and the environment needs to be right at times. But it's also something that also needs space and time and distance. And you can't keep context switching from like, okay, now I'm going to be a business strategist and come up with a business case and articulate this. And then suddenly I'm going to come up with big groundbreaking ideas, or then jump into the nitty-gritty details of a user experience and the interface specifically, without taking some time to reset and recoil. I also think that something that I've observed being in the role that I have been in so far is that everybody was born creative. And I see that now even in my son. Without a doubt, we were all born creative. It's just the journey we've been on and the conditioning and the environments that we've been in that may have taken that away or set that aside. But I'm continually reassured by seeing more and more people now that are coming into consulting, that are moonlighting as DJs, that are got an online store with some craft that they're selling. They're really finding ways to express themselves beyond their work and not mix their identity up into work. But there's still a whole group of people, including myself, who would be, categorized as anxious achievers. And so I think for people like myself, it's really, really important to make sure you have other avenues beyond work to channel your energy into. And it doesn't mean you're not as ambitious because you're doing that. It doesn't mean you're taking your eye off the ball because you're doing that. In fact, you're doing yourself a favor by sharpening the tools and your mind and your heart and your body somewhere else so that you can cut like a sharper knife at work when it comes time. Don't become dull by only doing the same thing over and over again. Just like coming into this space today, I hadn't been into a studio in so long. It felt so good, and it still feels so good to be surrounded by all this equipment and everything else. I'm in awe. I just haven't done this in so long because I've been in a very different environment. So just changing your context and everything else, I think these are some of my closing thoughts just around nurturing your creativity. And if you find yourself in a stagnant place, there's a great book that I picked up a little while ago called The Creative Rebellion to reignite that in yourself. Typically, it'll probably resonate with people who are entering their 30s, perhaps. And so, I would suggest that if you need to reignite something, and if you're well into your 40s and 50s, and you really need to reignite it, you better read this book.
I think I'll get that book as well and check that out. It's cool that even at this stage of our careers, we're still like, wait, I need to revisit some of the basics sometimes, So now for the people who've been listening and who've probably stayed around until this end, towards the end, if they wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
LinkedIn. I think that would probably be the best way. I logged out of some social media platforms last November and I haven't logged back in. That was part of my boundary setting to create more time for myself and to create more headspace for myself so that I could think and create and reflect. So I'm on LinkedIn and I'd love to connect and we can start there.
Love it, man. This was a super fun conversation. I learned a lot. I also felt that, and without I'm taking a little bit of a leap here. I felt like I was talking to a version of myself in an alternate reality who went through sort of experiences, and you're constantly fighting the urge of, I don't want to fucking pick a niche. Shut the fuck up. I'm going to do the things the way I want to do them. And so I felt a lot of commonalities. Of course, there's a lot of differences as well. But I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it too. Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, folks.
Bye for now.